About to divorce, the millionaire agrees to one last night with his wife. But when he wakes up the next morning, he discovers something shocking. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Richard Reeves sat at his expansive mahogany desk, the panoramic view of downtown Boston shimmering through floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he radiated confidence, or so it seemed. A contract for a new real estate development lay open before him, its bolded figures and projected earnings enough to make any CEO proud. Yet for all his outward poise, a tightness pulled at his chest whenever his gaze drifted to the sleek phone near his right hand. He had spent the morning in a series of back-to-back meetings, finalizing a major investment deal that would expand his company's influence in several upscale neighborhoods. Shareholders touted him as a visionary, and analysts praised his unflinching resolve to maximize profit. But now, as afternoon light filtered through the office windows, Richard's mind wandered to a topic far more personal. There was a stack of legal paperwork in his briefcase, divorce papers, prepared and nearly final. He moved them aside earlier that morning in favor of the urgent real estate negotiations. Marriage, family, and feelings took second place in his life far too often. Barbara, his wife of 8 years, used to say that he treated his emotions the same way he handled his investments, with caution, distance, and a razor-sharp focus on minimizing any perceived risk. Yet here he was, hours from finalizing a divorce he had practically initiated, feeling an uncomfortable twist in his gut. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen revealed his divorce attorney's name. Richard let it ring a few times. Finally, he answered, voice clipped. "Yes, Neil?" The attorney spoke about the upcoming court date to finalize everything. Richard nodded mechanically, pretending he felt no regret. "I'll be there," he said curtly, ending the call. Another beep signaled a voicemail. Barbara had tried calling just moments ago. He stared at the phone for a second, debating whether to return her call or ignore it. He chose silence. Outside his office, the sound of hurried footsteps indicated the typical hustle of a busy corporate firm. Assistants moved from one cubicle to another, carrying files and updates. Even inside this dynamic environment, Richard felt oddly isolated. He glanced at the only personal ornament in the room, a framed certificate from a Boston business school. There was no wedding photo, no vacation picture, nothing that suggested a life beyond the pursuit of money. A gentle knock interrupted his brooding. His executive assistant, Nicole, a bright young professional with a sharp mind and empathetic eyes, entered with a cautious smile. "Mr. Reeves, the board members would like to debrief on the new contract. Are you available?" He sighed, stood and slipped on the mask of the efficient CEO once more. Work had always been his fortress. The meeting that followed went predictably, triumphant figures, appreciative nods, and plans for expansion. Through it all, Richard delivered polished responses. Yet beneath the streamlined presentation, a new kind of restlessness stirred in him, something that whispered of intangible losses overshadowing the financial wins. Once the board session concluded, Richard left the conference room and headed back to his desk. There, he found a handwritten note from Nicole. "Your wife called again. She didn't leave a message." He froze for a moment, reading the words twice. Normally, such a message would barely register. But today, it felt like a small rift in the surface of his carefully constructed world. He finally dialed Barbara's number, but it went straight to voicemail. "Barbara, it's Richard," he said, voice low. "I'm returning your call. Let me know what you wanted, brief, businesslike. a perfect illustration of how he had grown accustomed to speaking to the woman who once made him laugh over morning coffee and sit enthralled by her lively recounting of a new interior design concept. With a resigned breath, he gathered his belongings, including the divorce papers he'd tucked away. This time, though, he couldn't help but read the first page. Words like irreconcilable differences and division of assets glared at him. He recalled the memory of them standing at their wedding ceremony 8 years ago, hearts brimming with hope. How did we end up here, he wondered, a note of surprise in his own thought. Before leaving the office, Richard grabbed his coat and paused at the door, flicking his gaze across the wide space. The place was immaculate, polished, just like the image he presented to the world. But now, a crack was forming beneath that pristine exterior, and he couldn't shake off the feeling that life was pulling him toward a reckoning. He exhaled, turned off the lights, and walked out, secretly dreading the moment he'd return to that silent apartment where Barbara's presence, or absence, grew more profound each passing day. Richard parked his glossy black sedan in the private underground garage of the upscale apartment building he and Barbara used to call home. He almost hesitated before stepping out, feeling a vague sense of unease that had become familiar in recent weeks. Through the tinted windshield, he glimpsed a couple in a gentle embrace by the elevators. They smiled and chatted softly while waiting, a small bubble of warmth. He closed his eyes for a second, reminded of how he and Barbara once waited in this same spot, whispering about paint colors and furniture designs for their new home. He made his way upstairs, footsteps echoing in the vacant hallway. When he opened the door to the apartment, a surge of memories rushed at him. The day they moved in, the celebratory dinner they shared on the living room floor with takeout boxes, the excitement over picking out curtains. The tension was evident now, overshadowing these once-cherished moments. Gone were the casual signs of a shared life, the bowls of fresh fruit Barbara used to keep on the kitchen island, the fragrance of her favorite candles. The space felt emptier, barer. In the center of the living room stood Barbara. She wore a simple but elegant sweater and jeans, her dark hair falling around her face in loose waves. The slight furrow on her brow suggested she was tired, perhaps more emotionally than physically. Still, her green eyes held that determined spark Richard once found so alluring. She didn't smile. Instead, she looked at him with quiet resolve. "I tried calling you," Barbara said, arms crossed loosely, as though protecting herself. "I was in meetings," he replied, setting his keys on the marble countertop. "What's going on?" She gestured for him to sit on the couch, where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light. He noticed a few empty shelves where she must have packed away her belongings, leaving small gaps and an odd sense of finality in the air. "I have a request," Barbara began. She kept her voice even, but he sensed an undercurrent of emotion. "Before we sign the final paperwork and never speak to each other again in the same way, I'd like us to spend one last night here, together, in our apartment." His gaze flickered, displaying a mix of confusion and suspicion. "One last night," he repeated. "What do you mean?" She inhaled, measuring her words. "I mean a proper farewell. We've been living like strangers for months, maybe longer, but this place, it meant something once. I want a final night. Just the two of us, without lawyers or arguments about money. Maybe we can just be Richard and Barbara, if only for a few hours." Richard's immediate instinct was to question her motives. His mind, so well trained to detect hidden agendas, told him this might be a ploy. "And what exactly do you hope to achieve?" he asked, fighting the edge in his voice. Barbara shook her head, exasperation creeping in. "I'm not trying to manipulate you, Richard. I'm not asking for a second chance or some last-minute reconciliation. I just want closure." A night where we remember who we were, instead of rushing through a cold, sterile goodbye in a courthouse. He leaned back into the couch, resting his arm along the cushions. The idea felt strange, yet something about her plea stirred a mix of curiosity and nostalgia in him. It reminded him of simpler times, back when decisions were guided by love rather than finance. "All right," he said at length, voice low. "If that's what you want, I'll stay." She nodded, clearly relieved he hadn't refused outright. A long, awkward silence followed. They had once been so comfortable around each other. Now, every word felt charged, every breath too loud. Barbara walked into the kitchen and returned with 2 cups of tea, handing one to him. Richard accepted it, thinking of the many nights they used to sit side by side, discussing work projects and design ideas for her clients. Tonight, their conversation felt forced, delicate, balancing on the cusp of something unspoken. He tried to catch her gaze. "Why do you need this?" he asked more gently, curiosity softening his tone. Barbara paused, considering how to answer. "Because I need to remember what we had, and you need it too, even if you don't realize it. Sometimes you can't move forward until you fully acknowledge what you're leaving behind." Richard sipped his tea, a knot tightening in his chest. He realized he had no immediate counter-argument, so, with a resigned nod, he accepted her request. The weight of the upcoming morning, with its final legalities, loomed large. For now, though, they would attempt a fragile, perhaps bittersweet night together. And as the tension settled between them, a faint tug of apprehension pulled at Richard's thoughts. He wondered if this evening would truly offer closure, or if it would open the door to a flood of regrets he'd spent years suppressing. Late evening shadows stretched across the apartment's living room. Richard had moved to the old armchair by the window, drumming his fingers on its worn armrests, while Barbara lingered in the hallway, glancing at a collage of photos they'd once put up on a corkboard. The collage was mostly bare now. Only a few pictures remained, snapshots of them smiling during vacations, small glimpses of a happier time. Richard turned on a nearby floor lamp, its warm glow revealing the faint lines of worry around his eyes. Despite his outward composure, he felt a ripple of tension each time Barbara shifted in the room. He was well aware this whole last-night arrangement might stir feelings he had locked away. Pride was a powerful thing for him. It kept him guarded. But sitting in this half-furnished apartment, with the hush of finality hanging in the air, he couldn't entirely ignore the voice in his head, questioning whether he'd made a colossal mistake. He watched as Barbara took down one of the few remaining photos, a snapshot of them from a ski trip in Vermont years ago. They stood in front of a log cabin, faces flushed from the cold, beaming at the camera. She traced its edges before placing it into a small box. After a moment, she faced him. "I'm going to order some takeout. Do you still like that Thai place around the corner?" He hesitated, as though double-checking if he truly remembered. "Sure, pad Thai, medium spice," he finally answered. "You used to like the coconut curry, if I recall." Barbara nodded. "I still do," she said softly, picking up her phone to make the call. In the quiet that followed, Richard's mind drifted to the past. He could almost taste the tangy flavor of pad Thai they ate on countless busy nights, hurrying through dinner so he could rush back to emails or phone calls with investors in Asia. Barbara had tried to wait up for him, but eventually she gave up. He swallowed hard, realizing he'd never told her how much he had appreciated those small gestures of togetherness. Minutes later, Barbara returned, phone in hand. "They'll be here in about 20 minutes, she said, settling into the couch. She drew her legs beneath her and fiddled with a fraying cushion. "Richard, do you ever think about what went wrong?" "I mean, really think about it." He rubbed the back of his neck. He had always preferred to keep such conversations brief, but something about her question pressed on a tender spot. "I suppose I do. Sometimes. I know I wasn't exactly present. Work always came first. He paused, forcing himself to speak honestly. Maybe it was easier for me to focus on numbers and deals, because those things felt more predictable, less complicated than human emotions. Barbara listened, her posture growing tense. Life is complicated, though, especially marriage. I never blamed you for having ambition. It's part of why I admired you. But you shut yourself off from me, from us, and at some point it was like there was an invisible wall I couldn't climb over. Richard's jaw tightened. Pride flared, urging him to defend himself, to say he provided financially, that he was building a life for them both. Yet a flicker of regret quelled his initial reaction. I guess I thought if I built a secure future, everything else would fall into place, but maybe I got it wrong. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Yes, somewhere along the way, you lost sight of the present, of me. They sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing on both of them. Neither noticed the minutes passing until the buzzer rang, signaling the food had arrived. Barbara stood and went to the door. When she returned with a paper bag full of delicious-smelling takeout, it was as if a small wave of normalcy washed over them. Richard brought plates from the kitchen, and they set them on the glass coffee table. The pair ate in near silence, interrupted by occasional remarks about the flavor or the softness of the noodles. Without the distraction of television or music, they had nowhere to hide from the tension that persisted. Finally, Barbara rested her takeout container on the table and sighed. I'm sorry if this feels forced, she said, folding her arms again. I know it's awkward, but I didn't want our parting to be just a signature on a legal document. Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. It is awkward, he admitted, but it's better than pretending there's nothing left to say. She nodded, meeting his gaze. A faint vulnerability crossed her features, a glimpse of the woman he once adored so deeply. In that moment, he realized how rare it had become to actually see her, to truly look at her without the shadow of resentment or blame in the way. For all his pride, for all the distance he placed between them, Richard felt a pang of longing for what they had once been, and an even sharper pang at what they had lost. After dinner, Barbara rose from the couch and walked into the small hallway, leading to what used to be her home office. Richard observed her retreating figure, feeling an unfamiliar urge to follow. His heart pounded uncomfortably in his chest, reminding him of teenage nerves rather than the steely resolve of a seasoned CEO. Finally, he stood, smoothing a hand over his shirt to compose himself, and made his way after her. He found her in the office, flipping through a collection of design sketches she hadn't yet packed. The soft overhead light illuminated her features, revealing a mixture of determination and hurt. When she noticed him, she closed the portfolio carefully. I was just thinking about my next steps, she said quietly. I'll need a new place to live soon. Richard nodded, his expression guarded. He moved to the bookshelf that lined one wall, where a small glass award with her name etched on it still sat. Barbara Reeves, Best of Boston Interior Design. He remembered the night she won that award. He had been late to the ceremony, rushing in halfway through her acceptance speech. Afterward, he offered a curt congratulations and disappeared for a phone call. The memory stung more sharply now than it ever had before. Where do you plan to go? He asked, trying to sound casual but failing to mask his genuine curiosity. She shrugged. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe a short-term lease downtown while I sort out my clients. Susan, my friend in Vermont, wants me to visit, but I'm not sure if that's a permanent solution. He cleared his throat, uncertain how to respond. The notion of her leaving Boston, leaving the orbit of his life, felt strangely unsettling. Yet pride prevented him from saying so outright. Instead, he took a breath and asked the question that had been gnawing at him. "Are you sure this divorce is what you want?" The directness of his words seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him for a long moment, lips parted as though searching for the right response. Then she released a soft sigh. Want and need are two different things. I never wanted us to end this way, but I couldn't keep living in a marriage where I felt invisible. That quiet honesty sank into him. In the past, he might have met her words with a dismissive argument, insisting he provided a good life. Now, though, something in him acknowledged her pain more sincerely. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice low. She gave a small nod. "I know you are, in your own way." He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. The conversation hovered at a crossroads. Part of him wanted to end it, to avoid the discomfort. Yet another part of him longed to probe deeper, to lay bare the emotions he had so carefully repressed. A flicker of memory crossed his mind. Back when they were newlyweds and struggling financially, they had picnicked on the floor of this very office after she managed to land her first big design client. They were tired, uncertain of the future, but undeniably happy. Now, he couldn't recall the last time he experienced that simple sense of partnership with her. Barbara rubbed her temples. "I'm just exhausted, Richard. I've spent so long fighting for our marriage that I don't have much fight left in me." The words felt like a punch to his gut. Perhaps, for the first time, he understood that by shutting her out, he had forced her to shoulder every emotional burden alone. Before he could reply, the lamp in the hallway flickered, revealing that the apartment's wiring might be showing its age. Barbara moved to check the switch, muttering something about needing to change a bulb. He followed her, only to see her teetering on a small step stool, reaching toward the overhead fixture. Concern sparked in him. "Barbara, be careful," he said. "Let me help." She paused, turning to him with a faint, bittersweet smile. "It's all right, I've got it." But the step-stool wobbled, and he instinctively placed a steadying hand at her waist. For a split second, their eyes met under the dim glow. The air felt charged, a tension neither purely romantic nor purely hostile. She hesitated, then gently stepped down, her hand briefly brushing his shoulder. The moment passed as quickly as it arrived, leaving a hush in its wake. "I should probably get that bulb changed later," she said softly, moving away. He nodded, unable to conjure a better reply. A string of words jammed in his throat, apologies, pleas, confessions of remorse, but all he managed was silence. They stood awkwardly for a moment. Then Barbara gave him a tight, acknowledging smile and disappeared into the living room. He stayed behind, staring at the faulty light, wondering when exactly their marriage had begun to flicker. The weight of his own inaction pressed heavily on him, intensifying his resolve to face the emotions he had spent so long burying. Much later that night, the apartment had grown quiet. The takeout containers cleared away and the dishes washed, each movement performed with a sort of uneasy collaboration. Richard lingered by the balcony's sliding glass doors, gazing out at the familiar city skyline. The lights of Boston twinkled in the distance, a symbol of the empire he'd built over years of relentless work. That skyline had always stirred in him a sense of triumph, yet tonight it was overshadowed by an odd pang of emptiness. Barbara approached quietly, still wearing the same sweater from earlier, arms wrapped around herself. She joined him by the glass, the two of them standing side by side without touching, their reflections faint in the darkened surface. She glanced at the city lights, then at him. "I've never seen you look so distant," she said. "Usually you're standing here talking about expansions and new projects. Tonight you're just lost," he offered softly, turning his gaze to her. She nodded, sadness flickering across her features. "Maybe, but at least it's real. You've spent so long keeping your guard up that I wasn't sure if you could still feel anything." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He studied her profile in the dim glow. Her expression revealed weariness, but also a gentleness he hadn't expected to see. As if sensing his stare, she turned, meeting his eyes. "Barbara," he began, but the words stuck. He remembered how she once teased him about his inability to articulate deeper emotions, how she found it endearing until it became a wall between them. She shifted closer, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of her perfume, a comforting reminder of better days. "Don't," she said quietly, though not unkindly. "Don't force an explanation if you're not ready." He swallowed, nodding slowly. "I just wanted to tell you that I do remember how it used to be, when it wasn't about numbers and business decisions. I remember the nights we'd laugh at something silly, or talk about your design ideas. I haven't forgotten everything." Her eyes searched his face. "I used to think that was lost forever, buried under the ambition you let take over. Maybe it's still buried. I don't know." He looked away, blinking against a surge of regret. Before he could respond, she took his hand, gently guiding him back into the living room. They stopped near the couch. The hush between them felt heavy with possibility, neither purely hopeful nor entirely hopeless. "Let's just sit," she said, releasing a breath. "We can talk or not talk, but I'd like to spend this last night not feeling like enemies." Richard nodded, slowly lowering himself onto the couch. Barbara settled beside him, keeping a respectful distance, as though testing the fragile peace between them. The quiet pressed on his ears, making him more aware of his own heartbeat. "Do you remember the night we decided to move here?" Barbara asked after a moment. "We were in that cramped apartment downtown, and you came home late. It was well after midnight," he interjected, recalling the memory. "I was dead tired, and you were wide awake, excited about a new property we just visited. You insisted we get the paperwork ready the very next day." She smiled faintly. "You called me impulsive." He returned a small grin. "And you said I was too cautious for my own good." They both laughed, quietly. For an instant, that old warmth flickered between them, a bitter-sweet warmth, tinged with the knowledge of what came after. Eventually, Barbara's hand drifted toward his. He hesitated, then let her fingers curl around his. The contact felt both comforting and terrifying, as if bridging a gap of years in a single touch. "Maybe that's the problem," she mused. "You were always thinking 3, 5, 10 years down the line, planning your empire, building your reputation. I was trying to embrace the present. Somewhere in the middle, we lost each other." He bowed his head. "I know. And I see now how I pushed you away." He paused, a tightness in his chest. "I just keep wondering if this is truly the end, or if there's something left." Her eyes flickered with an unspoken sorrow. She didn't answer directly, merely squeezing his hand in acknowledgement. Outside, a distant horn echoed through the quiet streets. They remained like that, side by side on the couch, each breath revealing the unsteady ground they stood on. Tomorrow's legalities loomed, and neither could pretend otherwise. Yet in the hush of that final night, there was a tenderness that hadn't surfaced between them in a very long time. When she finally drifted off to sleep, leaning gently against his shoulder, Richard let his own eyes close. For once, he wasn't calculating profits or worrying about the next big deal. Instead, he found himself wondering if he was losing something far more precious than any sum of money. And in that unspoken moment, he silently vowed to confront whatever came next, no matter how uncertain or terrifying it might be. The first hint that something was off came when Richard stirred in the early morning light and realized the other side of the bed was empty. He had expected Barbara to be there. After all, they had agreed to spend this final night in the apartment they once called home. His heart lurched in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps she'd gotten up to make coffee or simply needed a moment alone. Yawning, he slipped on a rumpled dress shirt from the day before and padded into the hallway, noticing the soft murmur of voices coming from Barbara's old office. At first, he thought she might be on the phone with an attorney or dealing with a client, but as he approached the partially closed door, he heard something that made him pause. It sounded like the steady pulse of a medical monitor, rhythmic and unmistakable. He gently nudged the door open. Barbara sat at her desk, laptop angled so that an older doctor's face filled part of the screen, with a second specialist in a smaller window. A swirling grey sonogram occupied most of the monitor's background. Barbara's eyes were focused on it, bright with a mix of wonder and trepidation. Richard froze in the doorway, heart pounding. At first, he couldn't make sense of the image or the conversation. Then he heard the doctor say, "We're looking at around 4 months. Everything appears healthy, though we'll keep monitoring her condition closely." Barbara murmured her thanks, then caught sight of Richard in her peripheral vision. She stiffened, uncertain whether to speak or end the call. The doctor's voice continued, explaining follow-up appointments and nutritional guidelines. Finally, Barbara mustered the courage to say, "Doctor, my husband is here. He just found out." Richard, pulse racing, stepped forward. "Found out what?" he asked, though his eyes were already glued to that sonogram. Barbara's gaze flickered to his face, and for a moment he saw tears threatening in her green eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly, hitting him with a revelation that shattered every certainty he had about their divorce. An array of emotions coursed through him: shock, disbelief, a surge of unspoken hope he barely understood. The voices on the screen seemed to fade. The only thing he could hear was the rapid thud of his own heartbeat. After all those years of failed fertility treatments, quiet heartbreak, and resigned acceptance that parenthood was never going to happen for them, how could this be real? The older doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, I was just informing Barbara that, despite her medical history, she's now at 16 or so weeks. The pregnancy looks stable, but she'll need consistent monitoring given, well, everything that happened in the past." Richard swallowed hard. Thank you, doctor," he managed, voice unsteady. He glanced at Barbara, struggling to piece words together. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Barbara ended the video call with a quiet goodbye to the doctors, then sat there, shoulders tense. She closed the laptop, plunging the room into silence. "I found out a few days ago," she admitted, "and I didn't want it to be a tool. I didn't want to use the baby as a reason to force you to stay married if you didn't love me anymore." He couldn't hide the hurt that flashed across his features. "Barbara, this changes everything," he whispered. There's a child." She folded her hands, her knuckles white. "I'm not asking you for anything, Richard. You signed those divorce papers. I only asked for one last night because, well, you already know why. But this baby, I wasn't going to give up on it, and I wasn't going to let it be a bargaining chip." He took a slow breath, steadying himself against the edge of the desk. "I never wanted to leave you with this alone. The moment I see that sonogram, hear those words, His voice trailed off, thick with emotions he'd tried so hard to keep buried. Outside, the sun was rising, sending a streak of pale gold through the partially drawn blinds. A morning that should have brought finality to their relationship now stood as a crossroads, utterly redefining the path ahead. All the carefully laid plans, court appointments, property divisions, future expansions, fell into a blur. Barbara rose from her chair, placing a tentative hand on his arm. I'm not going to hold you back if you still want the divorce, she said softly. I decided long ago that I wouldn't force anyone to stay, but I won't hide this baby from you either. Richard nodded, eyes damp. He gripped her hand as if anchoring himself to reality. If there's one thing I can't do, he murmured, it's turn my back on you and our child. In that charged moment, the weight of their shared past collided with the sudden enormity of their new future. And though neither of them had any idea what came next, one truth shone through like a beacon at daybreak. Life had taken a turn that demanded more than either of them had ever prepared for. By midday, the sun had climbed high over Boston, though Richard scarcely noticed the bright winter sky as he hurried into the living room, cell phone pressed to his ear. He was calling his mother, Margaret Reeves, who lived in Florida and rarely ventured north. After everything he'd learned that morning, he felt an urgent need to speak with someone who might offer a calmer perspective. The call rang once, twice. Finally, Margaret's warm, slightly husky voice answered. Richard, this is a pleasant surprise. You usually text. He closed his eyes, fighting an uncharacteristic trembling in his voice. Mom, it's complicated, but I need to talk. She paused, concern evident even at a distance. Go on. I'm listening. Richard hesitated, unsure where to begin. He paced near the windows, watching Barbara from afar as she carefully packed a small overnight bag. She hadn't decided if she'd stay in their apartment or head to Susan's place in Vermont for a while. Barbara's pregnant, he said at last. I just found out. Margaret inhaled sharply. Oh, that's unexpected. That's putting it lightly, he agreed. We were finalizing a divorce, Mom. We'd come to terms with ending it, and now this. For a few heartbeats, Margaret said nothing. He pictured her in her Florida condominium, crocheting or reading a novel, possibly reeling as much as he was. When she finally responded, her voice was gentle. Richard, this isn't the time to think about money or pride. You need to decide what matters most. He swallowed, glancing at Barbara, who was now on the phone with Susan. The emotional distance between them remained, but there was also a quiet bond forming around the reality of a child who, against all odds, had come into their lives. You think I don't know that, he mumbled, running a hand through his hair. I've been so focused on building my company that I lost track of what was happening right in front of me. Now that we've signed the divorce papers, I'm terrified of screwing up. Margaret's tone turned reflective. When your father left, I worried every day about whether I could raise you properly on my own, but you turned out all right. Not perfect, she added softly, but no one is. Don't let fear drive you to repeat his mistakes. Don't abandon the people you love out of pride. Richard stopped pacing, a rush of conflicting memories flooding him. His father had disappeared when he was just a boy, leaving only scattered explanations and Margaret's stoic determination to keep the family afloat. I don't want to be like him, Richard murmured. I never did. Then prove it, Margaret replied, her voice firm but caring. Be there for Barbara. Be there for that baby. He exhaled, feeling a swell of emotion. Thanks, Mom, he said. I appreciate it. They exchanged a few more words before hanging up. He realized this was the first time in years he'd actually asked for his mother's guidance. Usually, he consulted financial advisors or corporate mentors, never turning to her for anything but polite holiday calls. Yet something in her simple wisdom resonated more deeply than any business strategy ever had. Drawing a steadying breath, Richard approached Barbara, who had just ended her conversation with Susan. She looked up at him, her green eyes apprehensive. Susan wants me to come up to Vermont, at least for a few days, she said, She thinks it might help me clear my head. Richard reached out, lightly touching her arm. I understand. But before you do, can we at least sit down and figure out what we're going to do next? I can't just walk away after hearing the baby's heartbeat. She studied him for a moment, measuring his sincerity. All right, she said softly. I'll stay through tomorrow, then decide. They moved to the couch, an air of formality hanging between them, like two cautious acquaintances rather than spouses. Richard began by acknowledging the obvious. We've got a hearing set. The papers are signed. If we go through with the divorce, we'll have to negotiate custody and legal arrangements. If we pause the divorce, that changes everything. Barbara held her overnight bag on her lap, fingers absently tracing the handle. I never thought I'd have a child on my own, but I was ready to accept it if that's what needed to happen. She trailed off, her voice shaking slightly. He gently laid a hand over hers, feeling how cold her skin was. Barbara, I want to be part of this child's life. I made a mistake, many mistakes, shutting you out, shutting out the idea of a family, but I'm here now, if you'll let me. She blinked back tears, uncertain whether to trust him. Richard, I don't want you to stay out of obligation or guilt. I need to know that you really mean it, because the baby deserves more than a father who's only around out of duty. He nodded gravely, recalling his mother's words about not letting fear or pride repeat the past. I'm going to prove it. I don't have all the answers, but I'm committed to figuring this out, together, if you'll allow it. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative understanding that while the path ahead was uncertain, there might be a flicker of courage guiding them forward. Outside, the afternoon light cast the living room in subdued warmth. And as they sat there, hands hovering close, they sensed that a new kind of alliance was taking shape, one shaped not by signed contracts and profit margins, but by the quiet promise of a life not yet born. A few hours later, Richard found himself standing in the lobby of his company's headquarters, the stark contrast between personal upheaval and corporate routine hitting him full force. Men and women in tailored suits hurried by, greeting him with polite nods as they clutched files and laptops. He used to thrive on this rush, the swift exchange of data, the buzz of success in the air. But now, every step felt strangely hollow. He was here for an unscheduled meeting with the board to finalize details on a lucrative new real estate expansion. Investors had been pressing him for weeks to move forward. Yet as the elevator ascended to the executive floor, a prickle of unease gathered in the back of his mind. The deal would bring significant profit, but it also involved the demolition of an old residential block on the outskirts of Boston. Dozens of families would have to relocate. Pushing aside his personal worries momentarily, he stepped into the boardroom, where a handful of stern-faced directors were already seated. At the head of the table sat Charles Coleman, a key investor in his late 50s, with a firm handshake and a reputation for prioritizing returns above all else. Richard, Coleman said with measured politeness as Richard took his seat, we've been waiting to hear whether you've decided to expedite the demolition approvals. We're losing valuable time. Richard glanced at the neatly stacked folders in front of him. In the past, he would have nodded briskly and moved forward, calculating the risk of public backlash as a minor inconvenience compared to the financial upside. Today, though, images of Barbara's anxious face and the gentle thrum of a baby's heartbeat lingered in his thoughts. Something had shifted in him, a sense that money couldn't be the sole measure of his worth or success. Clearing his throat, he began cautiously. I've been reconsidering some aspects of the proposal. The families living in those old buildings, many of them don't have the means to relocate easily. Rushing this might cause a severe disruption to their lives. I'd like to look into alternative solutions, possibly renovating rather than demolishing, or offering fair compensation that allows them time to relocate." A ripple of surprise moved through the board. Coleman's eyebrows shot up. "This is a major change in direction. We've already put forth a timeline to investors based on your initial presentation. You're telling us now that you want to slow down." Richard inhaled slowly, maintaining an even tone. "I'm not against a profitable expansion, but I'd like us to be certain we're not sacrificing human well-being for a quick return." Coleman leaned forward, eyes cool. "You've always been a realist, Richard. That's why I backed you. Don't let sentimentality derail what we've built. People move, it's part of progress." A flicker of frustration rose in Richard. For years, he might have agreed with Coleman, but as he pictured a child coming into his world, his perspective shifted. If he wanted to be a better man for that child, how could he disregard the well-being of others so casually? "I'm not talking about sentimentality," he countered, tapping the table gently for emphasis. "There's a legal and ethical dimension here. Residents could challenge us in court, and even if they don't, public opinion matters. If we handle this responsibly, we can avoid backlash and build goodwill. That, in the long run, might be just as valuable as immediate profits." A murmur went around the room. Some directors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not fond of the delay. Coleman pressed his lips together, nodding slowly as though measuring Richard's resolve. "All right," Coleman finally said in a clipped tone, "we'll run additional numbers, but don't forget, time is money. I trust you won't let this turn into a sentimental crusade." Richard met his gaze without flinching. "Understood. I'll have a more detailed plan ready by our next session." He wrapped up the meeting soon after, promising to outline possible alternatives. As he walked out, he felt an odd mixture of tension and relief. He knew this slowed approach might cause friction within the company, but for the first time in a long while, he sensed that he was acting on principle rather than pure profit. Back in the lobby, Nicole, his efficient and empathetic assistant, hurried over with a stack of messages. "Everything all right, Mr. Reeves?" she asked, noticing his drawn features. He forced a smile. "I'm fine, Nicole. Just a lot on my mind." She nodded, stepping aside so he could exit to the street. Outside, a light breeze rustled the tall buildings that lined the avenue. Richard paused at the curb, considering how drastically his life was changing. Barbara's unexpected pregnancy, the shifting priorities at work, and the deep-rooted fear of repeating his father's mistakes. One of his chauffeured cars was waiting, but he waved it away. Instead, he started walking down the sidewalk, wanting to clear his head. Every step away from the skyscraper felt like stepping deeper into a new reality, an uncharted territory where his decisions carried not just financial weight, but moral consequences as well. Later that day, as evening shadows began stretching across the city, Richard made his way to a neighborhood in South Boston that stood in stark contrast to the gleaming high-rises of downtown. Modest row houses lined the street, many of them bearing the marks of age and weather. He could see families chatting on stoops and kids playing an impromptu game of street soccer. The sight stirred an unfamiliar pang of empathy in him. He thought about the potential demolition project, displacing communities like this, and how it suddenly felt personal. He was here to meet Thomas Baker, an old college friend who ran a small but respected consulting firm geared towards social impact projects. They had drifted apart over the years, with Richard diving headlong into corporate pursuits while Thomas focused on community development. Still, a phone call earlier that afternoon had sparked Thomas's enthusiasm. "Sure, come on by," Thomas had said. "I'll show you around, and maybe we can talk about your ideas." Richard parked his car near a humble brick building, a community centre Thomas supported. From the outside, it looked functional, if a bit worn, but inside, the hallway smelled of fresh paint, and cheerful posters about language classes and after-school programs adorned the walls. He found Thomas in a small office near the back, poring over plans for a new playground installation. "Rich," Thomas said, standing to greet him with a friendly handshake. He was a year older than Richard, with grey creeping into his temples and a more casual demeanour. "Long time no see. Glad you made it." Richard managed a slight smile. "Thanks for agreeing to meet on short notice. Well, life has gotten complicated." Thomas gestured for him to sit. The office was cosy, a far cry from the imposing boardrooms Richard was accustomed to. Pictures of local children playing sports and celebrating holidays lined a corkboard in the corner, a testament to the centre's community spirit. They spent a few minutes catching up on basics. Thomas mentioned his kids, Lucy and Kevin, who were growing up fast. Then Richard explained in broad strokes about the tension he felt regarding his company's new demolition proposal. He skirted around the details of his personal turmoil, yet Thomas, being an old friend, sensed there was more to the story. "You don't usually hesitate on big deals," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "What's different this time?" Richard paused, debating how much to reveal. "I guess I'm realizing there's a human cost," he said, choosing his words carefully. "People who live in those buildings, families, would have to uproot their entire lives. We can't just think about numbers anymore." Thomas studied him curiously. "That's a commendable shift, and it's never too late to rethink your approach." A small silence followed. Richard's gaze wandered to a photo on the desk showing Thomas's children beaming at the camera. He pictured an ultrasound on a laptop screen, the flicker of a heartbeat. His own child, currently unknown to the world yet so real in his mind now. Clearing his throat, he said, "That's where you come in. You've worked on revitalization projects that help communities rather than displacing them. Maybe you can advise me on a strategy that balances development with relocation assistance, or better yet, preserves part of these people's lives." Thomas's face lit with genuine enthusiasm. "Absolutely. I'd love to help. We've got experience bridging corporate interests with local needs. But be prepared. It's more complicated than a straightforward demolition. Takes time and effort to negotiate fair terms, secure alternative housing, or upgrade existing infrastructure. Will your investors go for that?" Richard grimaced, remembering Charles Coleman's skeptical stare. "They'll resist, but I have some leverage. I can frame it as a long-term reputation builder, less legal risk, less negative press." Thomas nodded, scribbling down notes. "Good. We can set up a meeting with local community leaders next week to discuss. They'll want to ensure you're serious about not steamrolling them." Richard offered a tight smile, relief mingling with trepidation. "That sounds like a start." Before they parted, Thomas gave Richard a quick tour of the community centre. They passed a small library room where a volunteer tutored children in math. The sound of youthful laughter poured through the halls. Eventually, they ended up by a modest cafeteria that served free meals a few nights a week to neighborhood families in need. Standing there, Richard felt a strange mix of guilt and hope. He realized he'd spent years living in a pristine bubble, climbing the corporate ladder, ignoring the everyday struggles of ordinary folks. Something had changed in him, was still changing. And though he wasn't sure where it would lead, he sensed that forging a path that considered more than just his bank account was the only way forward. He shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Thank you. I'll be in touch." "Any time, old friend," Thomas said, clapping him on the shoulder. "And hey, next time bring Barbara. I'd love to say hello." Richard's heart tightened. "Maybe I will," he replied. But deep down, He wondered if Barbara would still be by his side long enough to attend. 2 days later, Barbara had not yet departed for Vermont, though she kept her suitcase packed. She explained to Richard that she needed time to weigh every option, whether to remain nearby in Boston or take a break up north and sort through her emotions. In the meantime, the two of them occupied the same apartment like polite roommates, occasionally sharing cautious glances and tentative questions about the baby. During one early morning lull, Richard picked up his phone to call Thomas about the upcoming community negotiations. Barbara glanced over from the kitchen table where she sipped tea. "Thomas Baker, right?" she asked, recognizing the name. "He was the one who visited us a few years ago with the kids who raided our fridge for ice cream." A faint grin tugged at Richard's lips. "That's him. He's been a good friend, even though we haven't always stayed in close touch. He's helping me explore a more humane direction for this new real estate project." She looked intrigued. "That doesn't sound like the Richard I knew. No offense." He gave a rueful shrug. "None taken. I guess I'm realizing that there's more to life than landing the next deal, and maybe I'm not as comfortable stepping on people as I used to be." Barbara studied him carefully, as though trying to decide if this transformation was genuine. Then she said, "Well, if you're seeking a more considerate approach, you might want to talk to the families you're affecting. Interior designers aren't just about picking color palettes. We sometimes help adapt existing spaces to new needs. Perhaps there's a way to renovate these properties rather than demolish them." Her suggestion made him pause. For years, Barbara had quietly tried to share her insights, but he'd rarely given them due weight. Maybe she's right, he thought, scribbling notes on a pad. "I'd like to hear your ideas," he admitted, "and it would be nice if you joined me for at least one meeting with these residents. You've always had a knack for understanding how people live." She gave a small, tentative smile, though hesitation remained in her eyes. "All right, but I'm not committing to anything long-term yet. Let's see how it goes." That same afternoon, they drove together to a local housing committee's open gathering. The event took place in a modest church hall, with plastic folding chairs arranged around tables. Community leaders and residents filtered in, sharing concerns about rising rents and fears of displacement. Richard felt their wary gazes as he and Barbara took seats toward the front. Thomas arrived soon after, greeting them warmly. "Glad you both could make it," he said, motioning for them to stand beside him when it was time to speak. The hush that fell over the hall was palpable. Richard knew some folks recognized his name from news articles and business reports. Not all of those articles painted him in a flattering light. Thomas began with a brief introduction, emphasizing the potential for collaboration. Then he passed the figurative mic to Richard. "I'm here because I want to do this differently," Richard said, voice steady but humble. "My company's original plan involved demolishing certain older buildings, but I'm reconsidering. I'd like to explore renovating some structures or offering fair relocation options to those who truly want to move. I realize that for you, this may sound too little, too late, but I want to listen." A woman in her 60s raised her hand. "Mr. Reeves, my husband and I have lived in our apartment for nearly 3 decades. We've built a life here. We can't just pack up and go." Richard nodded, acknowledging her concern. "I understand, ma'am. It's exactly why we're looking at alternative solutions, like partial renovation or building additional floors above the existing complex, so long as the original residents can remain." Barbara, feeling the spark of her old passion for adaptive design, chimed in. "Sometimes retaining key structural elements and adding modern features can be cost-effective in the long run. We could update plumbing, wiring, and layout without displacing everyone." Her calm, professional tone garnered curious attention. A few people nodded, others crossed their arms, still skeptical, but at least they were discussing, not dismissing. Over the next hour, questions and concerns poured in about financing, rent hikes, legalities. Richard answered what he could, leaning on Thomas's expertise for the rest. Barbara shared ideas about interior modifications that could help families with children or elders who needed accessible spaces. By the end of the session, the mood in the room was cautious but a shade more optimistic. Several residents approached them, uncertain smiles on their faces. A handful offered contact information to continue the conversation, while others simply observed from a distance. As they exited the church hall, Thomas patted Richard on the shoulder. "That went better than expected," he said, then turned to Barbara. "You were a real asset in there. You both make a surprisingly strong team." Barbara and Richard exchanged glances, an echo of what they once were. Outside, a cold breeze whipped through the streetlights. The faintest sense of hope followed them, though neither dared say it aloud. For the first time in months, Richard felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a path for him that didn't mean turning away from everyone and everything he once cared about. That evening, after the community meeting, Barbara decided to stay in the city a bit longer. She still kept her suitcase zipped and ready, but the tension between her and Richard had eased into a more cooperative, if cautious, companionship. They weren't reconciled by any stretch. Too many scars remained. Yet the air felt less charged with hostility, replaced by a cautious willingness to see where these new developments might lead. However, Richard's budding sense of progress met its first real test the next morning. He arrived at his corporate office to find Charles Coleman waiting by the reception desk, exuding impatience. With his crisp suit and thinning silver hair, Coleman looked every inch the demanding investor, arms folded in a silent message of disapproval. "Good morning, Charles," Richard said, attempting a cordial tone. "I didn't realize we had a meeting scheduled." Coleman fixed him with a steely stare. "We didn't. I dropped by because I heard some concerning rumors about your little town hall meeting in South Boston yesterday. Are you seriously considering halting demolition in favor of renovations?" Richard squared his shoulders, signaling to Nicole that he'd take this conversation in private. They stepped into a glass-walled conference room. He closed the door, noticing how Coleman didn't bother sitting down. An unsubtle power move. "Yes," Richard answered directly. "I met with some local groups and discovered an alternative path. We can expand and modernize without displacing all the current residents. It'll take more planning, but the long-term benefits could be significant." Coleman pursed his lips. "And what about the short-term gains? We have investors expecting quick returns. If you delay this, it affects the whole financial model." Richard took a measured breath. "I understand, but there's a reputational factor at play, Charles. Forced displacement could cause protests, lawsuits, and negative press. In the end, we might lose more money trying to handle that fallout." Coleman shook his head. "I've seen you handle pressure before, Richard. You've never balked at tough decisions. This sudden empathy tour is out of character. Frankly, I'm concerned you're letting personal issues undermine your leadership." A flash of anger flared inside Richard. He thought of Barbara, of the baby, of the vow he made to himself to become someone better than a ruthless opportunist. Still, he maintained composure. "This isn't personal drama, Charles. It's a conscious pivot to a more sustainable, responsible approach. If it goes well, we'll stand out as innovators who care about community impact. That can attract a whole new class of investors, those who value social responsibility alongside profit." Coleman studied him in grim silence. "You sound like a man who's read one too many PR statements," he said dismissively. "Our priority is clear: deliver profitable results. Morality alone won't pay dividends." Richard nodded, acknowledging the man's stance without yielding. "I'm not ignoring profits," he insisted. I'm recalibrating so we don't sabotage our future growth. Forcing people out and tearing down entire blocks might net a quick buck, but it could cripple us down the line." Coleman's jaw tightened. "Then I hope you have a solid plan to keep investors satisfied. We can't afford to wait forever while you appease every disgruntled tenant. Remember, I'm the one who backed you when you were just starting to expand." "Don't push me to withdraw support." The veiled threat hung between them. Richard didn't blink. "My team is drafting proposals as we speak. We'll have a revised timeline soon, one that keeps the profit margins healthy while minimizing uproar." Coleman regarded him for another long moment, then exhaled. "All right, but don't test my patience, Richard. If the numbers don't add up, you'll lose more than just my backing." With that, he strode out of the room, leaving Richard alone in the echo of his footsteps. The conversation left a sour taste. Once upon a time, he and Coleman had been perfectly aligned, profit above all. Now, a rift was forming. Richard returned to his office, sifting through piles of paperwork. Halfway through scanning a profit and loss statement, he paused, thoughts drifting to Barbara. In a way, Coleman's words echoed the conflict in his own mind. Had fatherhood, or the mere possibility of it, really changed him so profoundly, so quickly? Before he could sink too deep into introspection, his phone buzzed. The screen showed a text from Barbara. "Doctor's appointment at 3 p.m. today. I'm going. Thought you might want to come." He felt a wave of relief that she was inviting him along. "She's giving me a chance," he thought. Tapping out a quick confirmation, he rose from his desk, noticing how each step toward fatherhood made him question the old corporate rhythms he had once embraced without hesitation. Later that afternoon, when he slipped out of the office for the appointment, Nicole cast him a curious look but said nothing. He found Barbara in the waiting room of a small obstetrics clinic, nervously flipping through a parenting magazine. She glanced up, her posture relaxing just a bit when she saw him approach. They entered the exam room together, greeted by a friendly nurse who took Barbara's vitals. As the doctor prepared the ultrasound machine, Richard felt a mix of anxiety and awe, uncertain how to reconcile these moments of intimate wonder with the fierce corporate struggle awaiting him. But when the soft thump of the baby's heartbeat filled the small room, everything else fell away. He reached for Barbara's hand, remembering Coleman's threats and the looming possibility of losing major investors. None of it mattered compared to this sound, a quiet, pulsing reminder that life was moving forward, whether he was ready or not. Barbara caught his eye, her own emotions swirling between caution and hope. No words were exchanged, but in that unspoken exchange, they acknowledged how far they still had to go and how vital these small victories were. Outside, late afternoon sunlight slanted across the pavement. For Richard, the real challenge lay in making choices that honored this unborn child and the woman carrying it. And for the first time in a long while, he sensed that the stakes were bigger than any boardroom ultimatum. Here, in this fleeting moment, was something that transcended profit and loss, forging a path he barely recognized yet dared to follow. Richard Reeves hurried through the hospital corridor, heart pounding, as he tried to locate the correct waiting room. The text message he'd received from Barbara read, "Minor scare. Doctor says I should get checked immediately. Please come if you can." He'd rushed from the office, leaving behind a half-finished presentation and a puzzled Nicole in his wake. Eventually, he found Barbara seated near a painting of sunflowers, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face looked drained, and although relief flickered in her eyes at his arrival, worry lingered too. He slid into the plastic chair beside her, subtly resting a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice low. She exhaled, nodding slowly. "I felt some pain this morning, and the doctor wanted to run tests, just a precaution. I didn't want to bother you at work, but—" She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her lap. He shook his head. "You did the right thing." "I want to know these things," Before they could delve deeper, a nurse appeared, calling Barbara's name. Together, they followed her into a small exam room. The doctor, a genial woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, asked Barbara a series of questions before proceeding with a quick ultrasound. As the faint image shimmered onto the screen, the rhythmic thump of the baby's heartbeat filled the air. Relief seemed to wash over Barbara's face the moment she heard it. Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. No matter how many times he heard that sound, it never lost its power to make everything else. Business deals, boardroom disputes, fade momentarily. The doctor offered a small smile. "Everything looks stable. You likely had a round ligament pain, which can be common at this stage. But we'll keep monitoring. Try to reduce stress, keep hydrated, and rest when you can." Barbara nodded, and Richard asked a few cautious questions. Within half an hour, they were back in the corridor, a mixture of relief and exhaustion hanging between them. As they prepared to leave, Richard's phone buzzed. He recognized the number. Charles Coleman's office. Tension gripped his gut. He let it go to voicemail, focusing on Barbara, who was leaning against the wall with her eyes closed. "Let's grab something to eat," he suggested gently. "After all that, you need a break." She agreed, and soon they found themselves in the hospital's modest cafeteria, trays of sandwiches and fruit in hand. Though far from a candlelit dinner, it provided a rare pocket of calm. For a while, they managed light conversation, nothing too deep but not superficial either. Richard noticed how Barbara's posture eased the more they talked. Eventually, though, his phone lit again, and a sense of duty gnawed at him. He quietly excused himself to return Coleman's call. Near a row of vending machines, he pressed the phone to his ear. "Richard," Coleman said, clipped and to the point, "we have an emergency board call in 2 hours. The city council is setting new regulations that could slow the entire project. You need to be there, or we'll lose our advantage." Richard rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'm at the hospital right now. Barbara had a scare with the pregnancy." A pause. "Is she all right?" "She's fine," Richard answered, some guardedness in his tone. He never expected Coleman to show genuine concern, but the mild inquiry took him by surprise. "Glad to hear," Coleman said briskly. "Now, about the board call. We can't afford to let these regulatory hurdles slip by. The council's preliminary vote is next week. We need a cohesive strategy to protect our timeline." Richard glanced over at Barbara, who was nibbling on her sandwich, oblivious to the conversation. "All right," he murmured. "I'll join remotely. Send me the details." When he returned to the table, Barbara looked at him with a hint of weariness. "Let me guess. Coleman again." He nodded, setting his phone on the edge of the table. "He wants me on a conference call in 2 hours. City Council is voting on new regulations that might delay the redevelopment plan." Barbara hesitated, then leaned forward. "Is it just about the finances, or do these new rules also affect the residents' well-being?" He appreciated her directness. "Both, actually. The regulations are partly environmental. They could force us to do more thorough inspections before any major demolition or renovation. It might slow things, but it could also ensure safer conditions in the long run. Coleman, of course, hates that." She took a sip of water, expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's an opportunity. If the city demands better oversight, you have a stronger case for a slower, more community-friendly approach. Coleman can't accuse you of dragging your feet if it's legally required." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I hadn't thought of it that way." He paused, an odd blend of admiration and sadness stirring in him. "You always were good at seeing things from a fresh angle." She gave a small half-smile but didn't reply. He could sense she was guarding herself. They weren't a couple joyfully expecting a baby. They were two people trying to find solid ground in a relationship that might still be ending. Yet in moments like these, he glimpsed the spark that once bonded them. As they finished lunch, Richard's thoughts swirled with conflicting priorities. He needed to craft a strategy for the board that embraced a more ethical, slower approach without alienating investors beyond repair. He also needed to be there for Barbara, whose well-being, both emotional and physical, had become vital to him in a way he never anticipated. "Come on," Barbara said softly. "Let's go home and let you do that call. Then maybe we can talk more about the next step." For both of us, her words, quietly pragmatic yet laced with tentative hope, resonated in him. With a nod, he stood, gathering their trays. Outside the hospital's doors, the city bustled on as though nothing monumental had happened. But for Richard and Barbara, every passing day brought them deeper into a new reality, one fraught with challenges and small victories that hinted at a change neither had fully foreseen. Richard sat alone in his home office, once Barbara's favorite workspace, staring at spreadsheets and city council documents displayed side by side on his laptop. He'd finished the board conference call barely an hour ago, and the tension from it clung to him like a persistent headache. Coleman had been relentless, pushing for an aggressive timeline to keep investors placated. Meanwhile, a few board members hinted they'd back a more moderate pace if Richard could show them concrete numbers supporting his approach. Barbara had retreated to the bedroom, presumably to rest. Since her hospital scare, she'd been lying down more often, reading up on pregnancy nutrition and various design commissions. The walls between them still felt fragile, neither fully open nor firmly shut. A gentle knock on the doorframe startled him. It was Barbara, hair tied back in a loose bun. Her face bore the signs of fatigue, but her eyes held a certain resolve. "You look like you're in your head," she observed quietly, stepping into the room. "All these council files." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the best way to comply with the new guidelines without losing more investor support." She eyed the screen for a moment. "I can help, if you want. My design background might come in handy." A flicker of gratitude rose in him. They hadn't functioned as a team in a long while, and he missed that synergy. "I'd appreciate it." He slid the laptop across the desk, and she pulled up a chair. Their hands occasionally brushed as they navigated the pages of zoning laws and building codes. Barbara pointed to an appendix about heritage preservation. "See, if the city designates certain buildings as historically significant, you could leverage that to avoid total demolition. Investors might complain it's slow, but from a PR standpoint, you'd look like the developer who's respectful of cultural sites." Richard pursed his lips. "That could shift the public narrative in our favor." He typed a quick note. "We'll need a thorough architectural review, though." She reached for a pen, jotting down ideas on a notepad. "I know a couple of architects who specialize in adaptive reuse. They're not cheap, but they're respected. Might be worth bringing them into the conversation." He watched her scribble, admiring her efficiency and clarity. Memories of their early years flooded back, late-night brainstorming sessions where they dreamed of building something meaningful together. A pang of regret surfaced at how he'd let that partnership wither. When they finally took a break, Barbara leaned back, stretching. "So how long can you hold Coleman at bay?" A wry smile tugged at Richard's lips. "That depends on how convincing these new proposals are. He's not the type to compromise easily." "Then you'll need to show him the potential long-term profitability," she said, turning serious. "Give him a reason to believe you're not just stalling for some personal agenda." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I appreciate you trusting me enough to give advice. It doesn't go unnoticed." She folded her arms, regarding him thoughtfully. "Richard, I'm doing this because it's the right thing for the people who live in those buildings, and also because it's good for the baby, knowing we're building a more stable, ethical world. Don't confuse that with me forgiving everything that happened between us." Her words landed heavily, but he nodded in understanding. I know I can't fix the past overnight. She stood crossing to the window. Outside, streetlights glowed in the dusk, and the faint hum of traffic drifted upward. I think I'm staying in Boston a bit longer, she said after a moment, her voice quiet, just until I'm sure this pregnancy is on stable ground. Susan's invited me up to Vermont anytime, but maybe now isn't the best moment. Relief coursed through him, though he kept his reaction measured. It's good to have you here, he said simply, and if there's anything else you need, appointments, rest, or help with your design clients, please let me know. She nodded, her posture softening slightly. I'll keep that in mind. A silence settled, filled with unspoken layers of emotion and history. She finally released a tired sigh. I should get some sleep. He rose from his chair, following her to the doorway. Barbara, thanks again. For helping with the files, for staying, it means a lot. She offered a faint half-smile, then slipped down the hallway. Left alone, Richard rested a hand on the doorframe, feeling the weight of unresolved tension. He sensed a deeper rift still existed within him. On one side, the old habits of ambition and pride, and on the other, the blossoming awareness of how empty life could be without genuine connection. Whether he could bridge that divide remained uncertain. But as the night wore on, he felt a renewed determination to try, both for the sake of the child he already loved, and for the woman he had so nearly lost. It was almost lunchtime when Richard's assistant, Nicole, alerted him that his mother, Margaret Reeves, was on the line. He'd not spoken to her since he first called with the news of Barbara's pregnancy, and a pang of guilt reminded him that he'd meant to update her sooner. Hurrying to pick up, he braced himself for the inevitable probing questions. "Richard," Margaret said brightly, "I've been worried. How are things? How's Barbara?" He sank into his office chair, rubbing his temple. "We had a scare, but everything's okay for now. She's staying in Boston, at least for the time being." Margaret's voice softened. "I'm glad. And you? I can hear the tension in your voice. Are you getting any rest?" Richard pressed his lips together. "I'm trying." He hesitated, debating how much to tell her about the shifting tides at work. "Mom, do you remember how I used to say I'd never let personal feelings interfere with business? That's become complicated." She gave a gentle chuckle. "Oh, I remember your certainty. Separate business from emotion, you used to say. But life isn't always so neat." He sighed. "It sure isn't. I'm dealing with a major project that could uproot entire communities. I'm trying to handle it more ethically, but my investors are pushing back. Sometimes I wonder if I'm in over my head." Margaret responded with quiet reassurance, recalling her own challenges when she had to raise him alone after his father left. "Your moral compass might feel new to you, but it's been there all along. Now you're letting it guide you. That's brave, son." The words struck him, leaving him momentarily speechless. Even after they hung up, he felt her reassurance linger, a steady echo in his mind. However, that moment of comfort was short-lived. No sooner had he ended the call than Nicole buzzed in, her voice tight with urgency. "Mr. Reeves, Charles Coleman just arrived, and he doesn't look pleased." Richard stood, adrenaline surging. "Send him in," he said calmly, though his heart pounded. Coleman swept into the office, eyes narrowed. Without waiting for the usual formalities, he tossed a slim stack of papers onto Richard's desk. "Care to explain this?" Richard skimmed the top page, recognizing references to the newly drafted proposals that slowed the demolition in favor of renovations. He had circulated them to the board late last night, hoping to prepare for an upcoming meeting. "They're revised outlines," he said evenly. "We're including a phased approach, so residents can remain in their homes while construction is underway." Coleman's posture stiffened. "I see that, What I don't see is any guarantee that we'll turn a profit on schedule. You're pushing completion into next year, which jeopardizes our short-term returns." Richard leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the desk. "Yes, it might shift some deadlines. But our public image improves drastically, lowering the risk of lawsuits or protests. The city council and local press may even praise the company for a more community-focused approach." Coleman scoffed. "You're trading in immediate gains for maybe some good PR. That's not how we do business." A surge of frustration coursed through Richard. "It's how I'm choosing to do it now. And it's within my rights as CEO to propose these changes, so long as we maintain overall profitability." Coleman smirked, a harsh glint in his eyes. "We'll see. The board meets in 3 days. If you can't produce solid financials supporting this revised plan, you might find yourself losing that fancy title." Richard clenched his jaw. He wanted to retort, to point out how short-sighted Coleman's approach was, but he swallowed his anger, determined to keep control. "I'll have an updated cost analysis ready by then. I'm not ignoring profit. I'm just balancing it with a sustainable approach." Something in his firm tone made Coleman pause. He picked up the papers again, tapping them against the edge of the desk. "3 days," he repeated, turning to leave. "Give me a reason not to rally the other investors against you." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Richard in a silence that buzzed with unresolved tension. He slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For a long while, he stared at the cityscape beyond the window, weighing the precarious balance between his moral stance and the very real threat to his position. Eventually, the pang in his stomach reminded him he'd missed lunch. Rising, he left the office to walk to a nearby cafe. Perhaps fresh air would help him think more clearly. But even the bustle of midday Boston couldn't erase the nagging sense of vulnerability he felt. As he sipped a lukewarm coffee in a plastic cup, he recalled the heartbeat from the hospital ultrasound. That gentle thump, so fragile yet full of life, echoed in his ears like a steady drumbeat driving him to stand firm. If it meant forging a different path, one less purely transactional, he was ready to risk it. The question remained whether his board, and perhaps even Barbara, would trust him long enough to see it through. The following morning, Richard gathered his top project managers in a smaller boardroom adjacent to his office. Stacks of folders and laptops covered the long conference table, and a tense hum filled the air as he explained the new phased approach. These managers were the ones who'd have to implement it, after all, and their feedback mattered greatly. "All right," said Janice, a sharp-minded project lead with rimless glasses. "We can segment the renovations building by building, focusing first on updating infrastructure, plumbing, wiring, and structural reinforcements, so the current residents can remain safe. In parallel, we could start construction on new housing units for those who do want to relocate." Richard nodded. "That way, no one's forced out, and we maintain a flow of progress. Thomas Baker's consulting firm can help coordinate with community leaders." A young architect named Marcus spoke up next. "We'll have to do a thorough assessment of each building to confirm the foundation can handle partial reconstruction. Otherwise, we'll need additional permits." Richard's eyes slid to Nicole, who was typing notes on her tablet at lightning speed. "Nicole, can you compile the permit requirements and cross-reference them with the City Council's new regulations?" She looked up. "Already on it, Mr. Reeves." For the next 2 hours, they hashed out budgets, timelines, and projected ROI under the revised plan. While it was undeniably more complex than a straightforward demolition, Richard sensed the team's cautious optimism. There was something energizing about creating a project that promised not only profit, but also community benefit. When they finally adjourned, Janice gave a firm nod. "I think we can make this work, as long as the board is willing to give us breathing room." Richard mustered a determined smile. That's my battle to fight. But I'm grateful for your support. He stepped into the hallway, feeling a small wave of relief that at least some of his staff believed in the vision. Passing by Nicole's desk, he stopped. Good job back there, he said quietly. I know this is a lot of extra work. She offered a soft smile. I believe in what we're doing, Mr. Reeves. It might be harder, but it feels right. He nodded, then slipped into his office, where he found a fresh message from Barbara waiting on his phone. Decided to go for a quick walk in the park. Could you join me? A corner of his mouth lifted. They hadn't taken a walk together in ages, and it felt almost surreal to see her inviting him so casually. Without hesitation, he texted back, "Meet you there in 15." Minutes later, he exited the building and made his way to a nearby park, a small green space nestled between tall apartments. He spotted Barbara near a bench beneath a willow tree, wearing a light coat and a scarf. She was gazing at a couple of children playing with a frisbee. Something about her posture suggested a mix of longing and uncertainty. When he approached, she turned, a faint smile on her lips. "Thanks for coming," she said softly. He motioned for them to walk, and they fell into step along the winding path. The mild weather softened the city's typical hustle, and every so often, a burst of laughter from the playground reached them. Barbara spoke first, glancing at him with curiosity. "You look resolved today. Did something happen?" He chuckled ruefully. "I had a tense showdown with Coleman yesterday. But I also had a productive meeting with my project team this morning. They're on board with a slower, more community-friendly approach." She raised her eyebrows. "You're really doing it then. Going all in on this new direction." He pushed his hands into his coat pockets, shoulders rising and falling in a silent exhale. I have to present it to the board soon. Either they accept, or they might try to force me out." She paused mid-step, turning to face him. "You could lose your position." He nodded, trying to keep his tone casual even as his chest tightened. "It's a possibility, but I'd rather fight and risk losing than roll over and do something I can't justify anymore." Her gaze flickered with concern, and he sensed her resisting the urge to reach out. "I appreciate you telling me." They continued walking, and eventually Barbara linked her arm through his, a cautious gesture that reminded him of how they used to stroll together. When the conversation resumed, it was gentle and free-flowing, touching on her current design projects, her clients, the subtle changes she'd noticed in her body now that she was approaching the 5th month of pregnancy. A soft breeze rustled the willow branches, and for a brief moment, Richard let himself imagine a future where they might walk here again, hand in hand, perhaps pushing a stroller. He tried to push the thought aside, fearing it would be premature, but the warm flicker of hope remained. By the time they looped back to the park entrance, Barbara slowed. "I'm not sure what the future holds for us," she confessed, reading his thoughts with uncanny precision. "But I'm seeing a side of you that I missed. Keep showing me this, Richard, and maybe we can figure out something real again." Her words lingered in the air, an invitation to continue forging a fragile path. As they parted ways, she heading home to rest, he returning to finalize more paperwork, he felt an unexpected sense of calm, a glimmer of strength that buoyed him against the swirling uncertainties. This was more than a business pivot. It was a transformation he could no longer ignore. During the next few days, Richard worked tirelessly, pulling late nights in his home office while Barbara rested in the bedroom. He refined profit and loss statements, compiled environmental and social impact metrics, and looped in Thomas Baker to ensure the community aspect was highlighted. Sleep became a secondary concern, overshadowed by the urgent need to present a robust argument at the upcoming board meeting. On the morning of the presentation, he rose before dawn, heart rattling with nervous energy. He put on a tailored navy suit, straightened his tie, and checked the folder containing his final pitch materials. As he stepped out of the bedroom, Barbara stirred, propping herself up on one elbow. "Big day," she murmured, voice thick with sleep. He nodded, fiddling with his cufflinks. "Yeah, this is it. Either the board embraces this plan, or they try to oust me." A faint crease formed between her brows. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. Even if I haven't said it in so many words, I see how hard you're trying to do the right thing." Her acknowledgement hit him unexpectedly. He felt a lump lodge in his throat, but managed a small smile. "That means more than you know." By the time Richard arrived at the corporate headquarters, the building was already buzzing with activity. Nicole greeted him, her expression a mix of optimism and concern. "Good luck, Mr. Reeves. I believe in you." He thanked her, then headed into the executive boardroom, where the most influential shareholders, including Charles Coleman, sat around a polished oval table. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city skyline, a silent reminder of the heights Richard had climbed and the distance he could potentially fall if things went badly. The meeting began with formalities, the usual introductions and a quick review of the agenda. Then Richard took the floor. He clicked through slides detailing the phased renovation, highlighting the positive public image, reduced legal risk, and potential new market segments. "In essence," he concluded, "this approach secures our reputation as an innovative, community-conscious developer. It respects both profitability and the human side of our business. Over 5 years, we project a revenue increase of 10 to 15%, largely thanks to brand loyalty and local government incentives." He paused, scanning the room. Some board members nodded thoughtfully. Others wore blank expressions. Coleman's face remained impassive. Finally, one member, a long-serving director named Elaine Yang, cleared her throat. "Mr. Reeves, what's the short-term cost? Specifically, how much more are we spending on this phased approach compared to immediate demolition?" Richard switched to a financial breakdown, pointing to charts. "We're looking at an initial outlay of around 8% higher than budgeted. That's primarily for structural analysis and phased reconstruction. But by year 3, we surpass the original profit curve." A few murmurs spread around the table. Elaine Yang sat back, mulling over the data. "It's not a bad argument, provided the City Council follows through with the tax incentives." "Are you certain they will?" Richard nodded, clicking to a slide showing a letter of intent from council members. "They've signaled strong support for ethical redevelopment. It's not guaranteed, but it's likely." At that, Charles Coleman leaned forward, fingertips drumming against the table. "We've built this company on decisive action, Richard. Now you're saying we should bank on a future that requires City Council goodwill and uncertain PR benefits. You'll forgive me if I remain skeptical." Richard stayed calm, remembering Barbara's reminder about focusing on both moral conviction and solid numbers. "I understand the skepticism. We can continue forcing a quick turnaround, but that leaves us vulnerable to public backlash and lawsuits from displaced residents. This new path doesn't just mitigate risk, it positions us as a leader in socially responsible development. That's increasingly important to a growing segment of younger investors." Coleman's expression tightened. He glanced around the table. "Do you all buy that? That millennials and PR brownie points are worth sacrificing immediate profit?" "Because I'm not convinced." Elaine Yang tilted her head. "Let's not dismiss the future investment landscape, Charles. There's a reason socially responsible funds are growing, and if the numbers align by year 3, it might not be a sacrifice at all." A flurry of debate broke out. Some directors echoed Coleman's concerns, others aligned with Elaine. Richard noticed a few quieter board members looking swayed by the logic of the phased plan. Yet uncertainty clung to the room like a dense fog. Sensing the tension, Richard offered a final, earnest appeal. "I'm not asking we abandon profit. I'm asking we evolve. The world is changing, and if we refuse to adapt, we risk being left behind. Let's secure both our bottom line and our ethics." The debate continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Coleman called for a vote. One by one, each member voiced support or opposition. Some responses came grudgingly, others with cautious enthusiasm. When the tally was done, the result was close, but in favor of Richard's proposal by a narrow margin. A swirl of relief and lingering apprehension hit him. They had agreed to proceed with the revised plan, but it was no landslide. A number of concessions were attached: regular review checkpoints, budget oversight committees, and performance triggers. If the project faltered, Richard knew Coleman wouldn't hesitate to push for a leadership change. As the meeting wrapped, directors filed out, some offering polite smiles, others hurrying away with muttered phone calls. Coleman paused by the door, fixing Richard with a measured stare. "You got what you wanted for now," he said curtly. Then he turned and walked off. Alone in the boardroom, Richard felt a tremor run through his body. He had climbed a steep peak today, but the summit was far from stable. Taking a breath, he gathered his papers, trying to muster the energy to share the outcome with Barbara. Outside those windows, the city glimmered, a sprawling testament to the legacy he had spent years building. Now, it seemed the true ordeal was just beginning, and he'd need every ounce of determination to see it through. Richard glanced at the clock on the dashboard as he maneuvered his black sedan through Boston's afternoon traffic. He was already running late for a press briefing scheduled at City Hall, where he'd be discussing his company's revised redevelopment plan. The board's narrow approval had catapulted him into a flurry of public appearances and negotiations, an exhausting gauntlet he had to navigate if he wanted to solidify support. Earlier that morning, Elaine Yang had encouraged him to speak candidly with reporters. "We need the public on our side, Richard. Don't sugarcoat the complexities, but show them the benefits," she had advised. He intended to heed her words. Propping a stack of cue cards on the passenger seat, he rehearsed potential questions in his head, mind racing from one talking point to the next. At last, he pulled into a parking space and jogged up the stone steps into the grand, marble-floored lobby. Photographers and a handful of journalists crowded a small stage area near the council chambers. When he stepped up to the podium, microphones bristled like porcupine quills in front of him. He cleared his throat, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his spine despite the building's air conditioning. "Thank you all for being here," he began, projecting as much confidence as he could muster. He outlined his intention to balance the project's profitability with the well-being of local residents, emphasizing new job opportunities during construction and the expanded tax revenue for the city. "We believe this will create a lasting positive impact," he concluded. A flurry of questions followed. How will this affect current tenants? Are you behind schedule? What about your investors' concerns? Richard answered each in turn, drawing on the data he and his team had compiled. A few murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd, though skepticism still lingered. Just when he thought he'd navigated the toughest queries, another reporter raised her hand, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Mr. Reeves, what do you say to critics who accuse your company of using community-friendly language as a mere public relations stunt? Some believe you have no real intention of following through." A flash of anger sparked within him, but he kept his composure. "Actions speak louder than words," he replied. "We've formally committed to phased renovation, initiated dialogue with community leaders, and slowed demolition orders. I've taken this plan before my board of directors, at significant personal risk, because I believe it's the right course of action." The reporter didn't appear fully convinced, but she nodded, jotting down notes. Richard exhaled as the press briefing wound down. While not entirely smooth, the event at least gave him a platform to present his stance. When he stepped aside, the crowd thinned, and he caught sight of Charles Coleman standing off to one side, face unreadable. Apparently, Coleman had slipped in at some point, witnessing Richard's statements. The investor approached with measured steps. "That was quite the performance," Coleman said, voice neutral. Richard forced a thin smile. "This is reality, Charles, not a performance. We have to engage the public honestly." Coleman's gaze flicked to the reporters packing their gear. "Engaging the public is one thing. Over-promising is another. Some of your answers sounded idealistic." Richard felt his shoulders tense. "Would you rather we keep everything behind closed doors until it's too late for constructive input?" A faint scoff. "I'd rather maintain the leverage to make tough decisions without your moral posturing clouding the facts. Don't forget, all it takes is a couple of bad financial quarters and the board could shift drastically against you. This project is your gamble, not mine." Despite the heated words, Richard steadied his tone. "I'm aware of the risks, but running from them won't solve anything." Coleman gave him a curt nod, then left, without so much as a polite goodbye. Watching the man's rigid form disappear down the hallway, Richard swallowed the knot in his throat. The confrontation simmered just beneath the surface, and he knew it was far from resolved. Exiting the building, he was met by the cool breeze outside. Boston's skyline glimmered under the late afternoon sun. He remembered his next stop, a site inspection with Thomas Baker and Barbara, who'd volunteered a bit of her design expertise to address the existing structure's potential. Arriving at the project site, he found Thomas and Barbara standing near a row of brownstone buildings that had clearly seen better days, peeling paint, broken windows, uneven sidewalks. Residents peered from their doorways, a mix of curiosity and caution in their eyes. Barbara offered him a subdued smile. "We've been walking around, talking to people. Some of them are still skeptical, but they're open to hearing specifics." Thomas pulled out a map. "We were thinking of preserving the facades and updating the interiors. It could retain the neighborhood's character while improving safety and comfort." Richard listened, tension from the press briefing gradually easing as he immersed himself in the on-the-ground realities, talking to actual residents, brainstorming solutions alongside Barbara and Thomas. This was the real work, far more meaningful than sparring with Coleman in polished corridors. A woman in her 50s approached, wiping her hands on a floral apron. "My granddaughter goes to school near here," she said quietly. "We can't move too far, or I can't pick her up each day. Are we going to lose our home?" Before Richard could speak, Barbara gently stepped forward. "That's why we're trying to renovate rather than demolish. We'll do our best to keep you in your home if you want to stay." The woman's eyes flickered with guarded hope. "I appreciate that. But I've heard empty promises before." Richard placed a hand on Barbara's shoulder in silent affirmation, then looked the woman in the eye. "We're determined to prove it's not just talk," he said. In that moment, he felt the weight of this confrontation more acutely than ever, more than the board meetings, the press conferences, even Coleman's warnings. It was here, face to face with people whose lives hinged on the project, that his convictions would be tested to the fullest. Late that same evening, Richard sank into the living room couch, legs aching from hours spent pacing around the redevelopment site. The day's chaos finally caught up with him, pressing on his temples like a tightening vice. Barbara was in the kitchen, fixing tea, a familiar, comforting routine that reminded him of a time before their marriage began to fracture. Moments later, she joined him on the couch with 2 steaming mugs, the gentle scent of chamomile rising in the still air. Her green eyes briefly flicked over his face, concern clear in her expression. "You've been on your feet all day," she said quietly. When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours? He rubbed the back of his neck. I can't remember, he admitted, managing a tired smile. But everything is so precarious. I feel like if I ease off, the entire plan will fall apart. I can't afford to let Coleman push me aside. Barbara handed him a mug, her fingers brushing his momentarily. Coleman is a problem, sure, but you can't shoulder everything alone. This project is a team effort. Thomas, Janice, Marcus, Elaine Yang on the board. You're not the only one fighting for this vision. He recognized her attempt to reassure him. Sipping his tea, he considered how differently their dynamic felt compared to just a couple of months earlier. Back then, they were on the brink of finalizing a divorce, speaking mostly through lawyers. Now, they sat together, discussing shared concerns about a future that still seemed tentative. I saw the way you interacted with those residents today, Barbara continued. You took time to listen, to answer questions, to reassure them. That's not the Richard I used to know. The one who always had a phone pressed to his ear, rushing off to the next big deal. A rueful chuckle escaped him. Yeah, that old me was pretty focused on numbers and bottom lines, but I guess something shifted. I realized I couldn't keep ignoring people's lives or yours. His gaze landed on her growing belly, just beginning to show beneath her sweater. A pang of protectiveness coursed through him. He still felt stunned at the reality of impending fatherhood, and that feeling fueled his determination to be better than the man he'd once been. They fell into a companionable silence, broken only by the soft clink of their mugs as they drank. Eventually, Barbara set hers down and pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. I went to my doctor today for some blood tests, she said, her tone carefully calm. I'm due for another ultrasound soon. The baby is healthy so far, but they're keeping a close eye on me because of past fertility issues. His heart lurched at the subtle fear in her voice. And you're feeling okay? No more pains? She shook her head. I get tired easily, but no severe pain like before. Then she forced a small laugh. You know, there was a time when I would have given anything to be pregnant, to share this excitement with you. It never happened. And then we fell apart. The regret in her words stung, and he set his mug aside, turning to face her fully. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, for us. I spent so much time chasing success that I never learned how to just be. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. I don't want us to repeat old patterns. This baby, this chance we never thought we'd get, means I can't afford to relive the past. Neither can you. He nodded, reaching out carefully to rest a hand over hers. I'm trying to make up for lost time, he said, voice tight with emotion, both with you and with the people who might be impacted by this project. It's all connected somehow. She squeezed his hand, then released it, drawing back ever so slightly. I see that, but I also need to protect myself. The emotional toll. It was too big last time. If we're going to move forward, we do it one step at a time, with no more secrets or half-truths. Richard inhaled slowly, understanding the boundaries she was setting. Deal, he murmured. Outside, a distant siren wailed, cutting through the quiet city night. In the hush that followed, he felt a subtle shift, like the deep breath before a leap into the unknown. All the doubts about fatherhood, about the viability of his new corporate ethos, about whether Barbara would ultimately choose to rebuild their life together, gnawed at him. Yet beneath the anxiety, an unexpected steadiness took hold. He placed his empty mug on the coffee table and leaned back, letting his eyes drift shut. I'll try to get some sleep, he said softly. Tomorrow's another big day. Barbara nodded, taking his cue to stand and stretch. For now, rest, she whispered. We'll face it in the morning. She slipped down the hall, leaving him in the glow of a single lamp. As he listened to her footsteps fade, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't dreading tomorrow. Yes, the stakes were higher than ever, but he was oddly grateful for the chance to rebuild not just a company's mission statement, but the foundations of a life that still had room for hope and change. Early the next day, sunlight spilled into the living room, revealing the faint lines of fatigue beneath Richard's eyes as he brewed coffee. Barbara was still asleep, and he wanted to let her rest. Though he'd woken with a swirl of anxieties about the project timeline, something felt lighter in him, a guarded optimism he hadn't experienced in years. He recalled the conversation from the night before, how Barbara had opened up about her fears and insisted on transparent communication. It felt like they were stepping onto a narrow bridge, each uncertain if the other would hold steady. Still, it was progress. Setting aside his own concerns, he headed to the office for an early round of calls with the architectural team. Once settled behind his desk, he discovered an email from Thomas Baker containing updated community outreach plans. Thomas proposed hosting a weekend event at the project site, complete with food trucks, design sketches on display, and open Q&A with locals. The goal: build trust. Without hesitation, Richard typed back, "I'm in. Let's talk details." He had just hit send when his phone buzzed. It was Janice, his ever-efficient project manager. "Richard, we've got a snag," she announced, voice tight. "Some tenants in Building C started protesting because they heard rumors that partial renovation might not protect their rent from increasing. They're worried you'll push them out eventually." Richard stood, restless energy coursing through him. "Who's spreading these rumors?" Janice sighed. "Could be local gossip, but there's a chance it's coming from certain board members who remain opposed. Or someone within the investor circle, maybe Coleman's camp, stirring the pot." A flicker of anger sparked in him. "All right, stay calm. I'll head there right after my next meeting. We'll address it directly." The next hour passed in a blur. A strategy session with Nicole about the corporate budget, a quick conference call with the city council's liaison to confirm environmental inspection dates, and a short press interview to clarify, yet again, the project's phased approach. By the time Richard arrived at Building C, he found a small cluster of tenants standing outside, signs in hand, reading slogans like "Stop Gentrification" and "Our Homes Matter." He parked and approached them, heart pounding with trepidation. A man in his 40s, wearing a battered Red Sox cap, pointed a sign in Richard's direction. "Your company's lying," he accused. "One of your own folks told us we'll be priced out when renovations are done." Keeping his tone calm, Richard countered, "I promise you, that's not our plan. We're implementing rent protections for existing tenants, especially those who've been here long-term." A woman with short, curly hair narrowed her eyes. "Forgive us if we don't take your word for it. We've heard all this before from other developers." Pressing his lips together, Richard realized that good intentions alone weren't enough. Reaching for the folder under his arm, he pulled out copies of the policy draft. It detailed phased rent increase caps, relocation stipends if needed, and the option for residents to return to updated units at near original rates. He began distributing the pages. "This is the proposed framework we plan to finalize with the city's Housing Commission. It's not a PR stunt. We need your input to ensure it's fair." The group studied the sheets, murmuring. Some anger remained, but curiosity flickered in their eyes. One older woman asked, "And what's to stop your board from changing this once it all goes through?" Steeling himself, Richard admitted, "There's always risk, but my team and I are committed. We're hosting a community event this weekend to discuss details openly. We want your help. If there's a clause we missed, let's talk about it." Slowly, the protesters lowered their signs, though skepticism lingered. The man in the Red Sox cap shook his head, but seemed less hostile. "We'll see," he muttered, handing the paperwork to another tenant. Richard didn't expect immediate trust, but this small shift was progress. He spent another half-hour answering questions, clarifying that he was aware some board members might resist. He explained how he'd fought for the plan's approval, going so far as to risk his own position in the company. Eventually, the group dispersed, still guarded but no longer brandishing signs. Richard exhaled, shoulders aching from the tension. This is what transformation looks like. Slow, uncertain, but real, he reminded himself. Back at his car, he spotted Barbara's number lighting up his phone. He answered, hearing her warm, if slightly strained, voice. "Just checking in," she said. "You okay?" He glanced around at the once antagonistic crowd now talking calmly among themselves. "I'm all right," he replied. "Had to smooth out a few rough edges, but I think we're making progress." She paused, then added, "Thomas mentioned the weekend event. I can help set up design sketches or answer questions about interior improvements, if that's okay with you." His chest tightened, a mix of appreciation and longing surging within him. "I'd be glad to have you there." In that moment, he realized how much he valued her presence, not just as a respected designer, but as a partner whose steadiness and empathy were quietly reshaping his life. The transformation in his mindset was no longer just corporate rhetoric, it was personal, driven by a baby's heartbeat he'd heard on an ultrasound, and by the look of cautious hope in Barbara's eyes. Late Friday afternoon, the city's unpredictable weather decided on a brief rain shower, casting a grey pall over the streets. Richard stood by a window in his office, watching droplets blur the view of passing cars and pedestrians scrambling for umbrellas. He'd been finalizing details for the weekend's community event, but his mind kept drifting to the tenuous balance he was maintaining. It was a balance between corporate demands and moral conscience, between pleasing shareholders and serving the people who called these rundown buildings home. And layered atop that was the fragile personal realm he was navigating with Barbara. Their nights were calmer now. Sometimes they even shared a meal in companionable silence or traded stories about past design ventures. But the uncertain future of their marriage still loomed, unspoken. Nicole knocked gently on the door, slipping inside with a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Reeves, I have the budget breakdown for the weekend event. We managed to keep the catering and signage within the original estimate." He glanced over the numbers, nodding his approval. "That's good. Do we have enough staff to answer questions?" She gave a confident smile. "Yes, sir. Thomas Baker is bringing some volunteers from the community center, and Barbara has coordinated with a local interior design association to set up interactive displays. It should show everyone how we plan to modernize without erasing the neighborhood's character." At the mention of Barbara, Richard felt a small wave of gratitude. "Thanks, Nicole," he said quietly. "I appreciate how hard you've been working too. None of this would be happening without the entire team's support." She beamed. "We believe in what you're doing." When Nicole left, he checked the time and decided to drop by the construction office on site before heading home. The plan was to confirm the final logistical details, then maybe treat Barbara to dinner, assuming she wasn't too exhausted from her own preparations. As he arrived at the site, the sky began to clear, revealing a soft twilight glow. Thomas and Janice were waiting near a makeshift stage that would host tomorrow's presentations. Plywood boards and white folding chairs surrounded them, evidence of the event's hastily assembled infrastructure. "Looking good," Richard said, surveying the modest setup. "Any last-minute emergencies?" Janice shrugged. "A few. The local permit office gave us grief about tents on public sidewalks, but I think we've sorted it out. Also, Coleman's office called twice. Something about wanting an updated cost projection for the next quarter. He seems anxious. Richard's jaw tightened. He'll get it soon enough. Let's focus on tomorrow. Thomas showed him a layout of the planned displays, ranging from architectural renderings to digital slideshows of proposed renovations. We're hoping to convey that it's not just about new paint, it's about structural integrity, safety codes, and a sense of continuity with the neighborhood's history, Thomas explained. Richard nodded, impressed. It's exactly what we need people to see, that we're not tearing down homes to put up soulless high-rises. They wrapped up the conversation quickly, each needing to head home for some rest. Richard was just about to leave when he spotted Barbara near a row of half-demolished buildings. She seemed lost in thought, gently running her hand along a cracked brick wall. He approached, footsteps echoing on the damp pavement. "Hey," he greeted softly. "Are you okay?" She glanced at him, lips curving into a brief smile. "Just thinking about the families who used to live here. Some of the bricks have personal graffiti etched into them, like little memories no one else sees." He drew closer, catching sight of a small heart shape scratched into the brick. "I never would have noticed that," he admitted. "I guess I'm learning to look more carefully." They stood side by side in the cool evening air, a quiet understanding passing between them. Then Barbara sighed, resting a hand on her growing belly. "I need to be honest. I'm still scared," she confessed in a whisper, "about our relationship, about my health, about whether we can really pull off this project without hurting people." His heart squeezed. "I know. I'm scared too. But I believe we're on the right path, even if it's full of pitfalls." She turned to face him fully, a seriousness in her gaze. "Richard, if, for some reason, this project fails and Coleman forces you out, or the board flips, is all of this going to unravel? Will you revert to that distant person who poured himself into work and shut out everything else?" Her question hit a nerve. He paused, letting the gravity settle. "I've thought about that. Honestly, I don't see how I could go back. Not after I've seen what truly matters. I'm not sure if I'll remain CEO forever, but I do know I won't abandon these people, or you. Maybe it took a miracle pregnancy and the threat of losing everything to realize that." Barbara studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge the truth behind his words. Then, with a small nod, she pulled her coat tighter against the evening chill. "We'd better head home," she said softly. They walked together toward their cars, the site now illuminated by a few security lights casting long shadows across the rubble and scaffolding. Tomorrow's event loomed as a crucial moment, an opportunity to prove their intentions to the residents and local stakeholders alike. It felt like the final push in a climb that had tested all of Richard's resolve. Though he couldn't foresee every challenge awaiting them, he sensed a building momentum, an emotional crest where everything he'd fought for would face its ultimate test. And for the first time, he allowed himself a flicker of faith that, even if the outcome wasn't perfect, the journey itself was forging him into someone he could respect. The following morning dawned bright and mild, a small grace for which Richard was deeply thankful. By 9 a.m, the redeveloped site buzzed with activity. Folding tables displayed architectural plans and posters illustrating proposed renovations. A few local food trucks sent mouth-watering aromas into the air, and a stage with a microphone awaited the day's speakers. Residents from the surrounding blocks trickled in, many wearing guarded expressions. Thomas and Janice greeted them, handing out flyers and explaining how to navigate the various exhibits. For the children in attendance, Barbara had set up a small mini-design corner where they could color pictures of houses or try out mock interior layouts on foam models. Richard circulated through the crowd, checking on each station. Everywhere he went, he offered a handshake or a quick nod, reminding himself to smile despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. He recognized some of the families from Building C, those who'd nearly broken into protest. A few approached him with questions, still cautious but noticeably calmer. By midday, the event was in full swing. Local musicians played gentle background tunes on a low platform, and clusters of people gathered around the design boards. Barbara and a team of volunteer interior designers demonstrated how existing units could be reconfigured to accommodate bigger families or elderly residents needing accessibility. A momentary surge of pride washed over Richard as he watched Barbara patiently answer a young couple's questions about future rent caps. She carried herself with professional grace, her bright eyes revealing an underlying compassion. This is how it should have been all along, he thought, us working side by side. Then he spotted Charles Coleman weaving through the crowd, flanked by two other board members. The man's presence pricked the festive atmosphere like a needle. Richard guessed he wasn't here for the free coffee. Steeling his resolve, he approached them. Coleman offered a perfunctory nod. "Quite the turnout," he remarked. "Seems you've staged a decent show." Richard reined in his frustration. "It's more than a show, Charles. These are real people seeing the plan firsthand." One of the board members, a man named Gregory, who'd been non-committal at recent meetings, observed the design boards. "I'm actually impressed," he muttered. "The idea of letting residents choose renovation options might win local support." Coleman's frown deepened, but he didn't voice outright dissent. Instead, he scanned the crowd. "We'll see if it translates to tangible returns." Before Richard could respond, Thomas signaled him from the makeshift stage. It was time for Richard to address the crowd. Taking a steadying breath, he climbed the few steps to the microphone. Barbara hovered near the front, offering an encouraging nod. "Good afternoon," he began, voice carrying over the hush that fell. "Thank you all for coming. My name is Richard Reeves, and I'm here to share our vision for a redevelopment plan that respects the neighborhood's heritage and the people who live here." He spoke of the phased approach, the protection against sudden rent hikes, the potential for new community spaces like a daycare or a small clinic. He made no grand promises he couldn't keep, but emphasized accountability and transparency. Mid-speech, he caught Coleman's narrowed gaze. His heart pounded, yet an undercurrent of calm flowed through him. This is bigger than Coleman, he reminded himself. This is about doing what's right. When he finished, a smattering of applause broke out, cautiously at first, but growing as a handful of residents signaled their approval. Thomas stepped up to introduce a tenant representative who gave a short, somewhat hesitant endorsement, stating they appreciated Richard's willingness to listen. The man concluded with, "We'll be watching closely, but at least now we have hope." Coleman, arms crossed, leaned in to whisper something to Gregory, who shook his head, looking non-committal. Richard stepped off the stage, exhaling shakily. Barbara joined him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You did well," she said softly. "The crowd's reaction seems optimistic." He searched her eyes, grateful for her support. "Thank you," he murmured. As the event wound down, many residents lingered, exploring the model units and sampling the last of the food truck offerings. The tension that had once pervaded the air softened, replaced by tentative curiosity. Richard fielded more questions, some suspicious, many practical, and though he couldn't quell every doubt, the overall tone felt positive. Later, as the sun dipped and volunteers began packing up tables, Coleman approached again, his expression unreadable. "You made an impact," he conceded, "but talk is cheap. If these renovations spiral over budget, you'll answer for it." Richard met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm aware of the stakes. We have a plan in place, and I stand by it." For a moment, they locked eyes, and Richard sensed Coleman sizing him up, deciding whether to escalate or relent. Then the investor gave a curt nod and walked away. Exhausted but buoyed, Richard turned to see Barbara watching him from near the design corner. She offered a small smile, one that held a glint of pride. In that instant, he felt something akin to a reward, not a victory lap, but the promise that all this effort might truly be worth it. Wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders, he guided her toward his car. "Let's go home," he said quietly, an undercurrent of relief in his voice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, budget revisions, investor calls, possibly more friction with Coleman. But for now, as the glow of late afternoon cast a warm hue over the site, he savored the first real sign that their hard work was carving out the possibility of a better future. Richard Reeves stepped onto the balcony of his apartment, a mug of coffee in hand, and took in the hush of an early morning sky. The sun had barely risen, painting the horizon with lavender and gold. Below, the city began to stir, taxis rolling down half-empty streets and a few eager joggers passing by. It had become a small ritual of his lately, stealing these dawn moments to gather himself before the day's events took over. Inside, Barbara was still asleep, her breathing soft in the quiet bedroom. In a few hours, they would drive to yet another meeting, this time with the city's housing commission, to finalize how the phased renovation plan would legally protect tenants' rents. The successful community event had smoothed many ruffled feathers, but the real challenge remained in converting goodwill into binding agreements. He set the mug on a ledge and glanced at his phone, bracing himself for the usual flood of messages. Sure enough, there were notifications from board members, project managers, and more than one skeptical investor. Yet he found himself smiling, a distant yet genuine lightness in his chest. Things were far from perfect, but every step felt closer to the life he wanted to lead. When he returned inside, Barbara was stirring. Her eyes fluttered open, and he could see a trace of lingering sleepiness. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning," he replied gently. "I was letting you rest, feeling okay," she yawned, mostly just a little stiff. Carefully, she pushed back the covers, revealing the gentle curve of her belly. She rested a hand there, as if silently checking that everything was fine. "I have a prenatal appointment after lunch," she added. "I was hoping you could come." He nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll just rearrange my schedule. The Housing Commission meeting shouldn't run too long, and they can't finalize anything without me, anyway." She offered a ghost of a smile. The trust implicit in him prioritizing her medical visits still felt tenuous at times, but day by day, it was growing more secure. They shared a quick breakfast, scrambled eggs and fruit, before setting out. In the car, Barbara gazed at passing buildings while he navigated the traffic. The quiet that existed between them now was less an uncomfortable silence and more a peaceful lull. Whenever her eyes caught his, there was a spark of acknowledgement, a soft affirmation that they were in this together. At the city's Housing Commission office, they were ushered into a cramped but well-lit conference room. Present were two council representatives, a legal advisor, and Janice, who had arrived earlier to set up the documents. One of the council members, Councilwoman Lapointe, wasted no time diving into the details. "Mr. Reeves, we're supportive of the approach, but we need firm guarantees about the rent protection you promised." Richard leaned forward, a folder of paperwork in hand. "I've included a clause that locks in the existing rents for current tenants, plus a limit on annual increases tied to cost of living indexes. Any major rent hike would require approval from an independent review board." Councilwoman Lapointe studied the document with a critical eye. "If that's indeed binding, and your company can't override it later, it goes a long way to easing resident fears. But how do you handle new tenants moving in after renovations? Won't they face higher rents?" "They will," Richard admitted. though we're capping increases for at least 5 years. It's still a business, but the goal is a balanced approach, fresh revenue streams to keep the project viable without pricing out everyone who's lived here for decades. Barbara listened attentively, occasionally offering a design-based perspective. At one point, she added, a phased approach also reduces the number of vacant units at any given time, meaning the building can start generating income sooner, mitigating the need for drastic rent hikes. The mention of phased revenue streams piqued the council members' interest. They asked follow-up questions about compliance, timelines, and how the city might enforce these terms. By the time the discussion wound down, the commissioners appeared cautiously satisfied. Councilwoman Lapointe finally closed the folder. We'll review this in detail, but it appears you've given us a workable model. I won't promise it'll sail through every vote unopposed, but it's the closest I've seen to a genuine attempt at balancing development with existing community needs. A small wave of relief coursed through Richard. Thank you, Councilwoman. We look forward to the official review. He rose to shake hands, noticing a flicker of genuine respect in the council member's eyes. Outside in the hall, he exhaled, turning to Barbara. I know it's not a done deal, but that felt encouraging. She nodded, her voice warm. I think they believe you're serious about this, and I think you are too. He studied her face. Let's head to the prenatal appointment. Then, I'm guessing we're both done with these formalities for today. A flash of anticipation lit her features. Sounds good. They walked side by side out of the building, a gentle breeze meeting them at the entrance. As they reached the car, Richard paused a moment to take Barbara's hand. She allowed it, squeezing lightly in return. Despite the uncertainties still looming over them, the board's ongoing scrutiny, Coleman's potential interference, the complexities of forging a new relationship, there was a fragile calm about this moment. And in that calm, a stirring of hope that this was more than an interlude. It felt like the start of something solid, even if they had miles yet to go. Later that afternoon, after a successful prenatal visit, where the doctor confirmed the baby was growing well and recommended Barbara continue her moderate rest, they found themselves in a small cafe near the old neighborhood where Barbara and Richard had first lived as newlyweds. It was a place with mismatched wooden tables, chalkboard menus, and the scent of freshly baked pastries lingering in the air. Barbara suggested it on a whim, and though it stirred memories in both of them, neither resisted. Seated by a window, they sipped warm tea, hers decaffeinated, with a lemon wedge, and watched passers-by hustle along the sidewalk. I haven't been here in years, Barbara commented softly, fingers tracing the chipped edge of her saucer. Remember how we used to sit in that corner table by the window, planning our life? You'd talk about building a real estate empire, and I'd gush about opening my own design studio. Richard smiled wryly. Yes, and I was convinced we'd conquer the world by the time we were in our 30s. Funny how life can spin us around. She gave a quiet laugh. We did succeed in some ways. You built your empire, and I had a thriving design business for a while. But somewhere along the way, we got lost. The words carried a weight that made him look down at his tea. I'm sorry, he murmured. I should have listened more, cherished more. Maybe if I had... She lifted a hand, stopping him. We both let it slip. I won't pretend your choices weren't hurtful, but it wouldn't be fair to say it was all you. I fell into my own resentments and never told you how deeply I was hurting until it was almost too late. They let the confession settle in the comfortable quiet of the cafe. Outside, the sky had turned overcast, a sign that rain might be returning. It seemed, however, that neither wanted to leave just yet. Eventually, Barbara leaned forward. Since we're here, would you like to take a walk past our old apartment? Just for a few minutes. A stirring of nostalgia and apprehension moved through him. "Sure," he said, paying for their drinks. "I'd like that." They stepped onto the sidewalk, coats drawn tight against a light drizzle. The route was only a few blocks, but each step felt laden with memories, shops they once visited, a bakery that used to be their weekend treat, a small park where they'd occasionally sit after dinner. When they reached the old brick complex, Barbara paused outside the main entrance. The building looked much the same, though a little more worn, paint chipping near the doorway. "We were happy here," she murmured, her voice tinged with wistfulness. Richard studied the windows, recalling how they'd framed the city's glow at night, when they'd stay up talking about ambitions and maybe, just maybe, starting a family. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, cautious yet longing for some closeness. "If I could go back and do it over," he said quietly, "I would have spent more time cherishing you instead of chasing every new deal." She rested her head against his shoulder for a moment. "We can't rewrite the past, but we can learn. That's enough for me right now." They lingered in that moment, the drizzle forming small puddles on the sidewalk. A faint sound of jazz music drifted from an upper window, and for a fleeting second, it felt like being transported back in time. Two dreamers on the cusp of building a life together. Yet this time, they were older, perhaps wiser, with regrets etched into their hearts. Eventually, a chill wind caused Barbara to shiver, and they turned away. "We should head home," she suggested, voice gentle. "I need to rest, and you have more work waiting, I'm sure." He chuckled dryly as they strolled back toward the car. "Work never ends these days, meetings, new investor calls. Coleman hasn't exactly gone easy on me, even after the big event. I think he's waiting for any small stumble to say, 'I told you so.'" Barbara nodded, then offered a hint of a teasing smile. "If I remember you correctly, you do some of your best work under pressure. Just don't let it consume you again, okay?" Her reminder warmed him. "Don't worry," he promised. "I have different priorities now." They climbed into the car, the engine's rumble cutting through the patter of rain. Neither spoke much on the drive, but the silence wasn't empty. Instead, it felt like a shared understanding of the weight and beauty of what they were trying to rebuild. By the time they reached the apartment, Barbara was nearly dozing, exhaustion seeping in from the long day. Richard parked, gently touching her arm. "We're home," he said, and she stirred. They exchanged a wordless smile before heading inside. Their old apartment building still stood a few miles away, a silent witness to where their story began. Now, the question remained whether their current path would forge a stronger bond than ever before, or fade under the strain of looming decisions. But as he helped her up the stairs, one hand lightly on her back, a renewed sense of purpose swelled within him. He would fight for this fragile chance at a new life, both for their marriage and for the child growing steadily within her. A brisk 2 weeks went by. The City Council issued a preliminary recommendation supporting Richard's redevelopment plan, which spurred a wave of cautious optimism among residents. Local newspapers ran features on the proposed renovations, often including quotes from Barbara or Thomas on community involvement. Even some of Richard's skeptics at the board seemed less vocal, though Charles Coleman remained a vigilant presence at every turn, scrutinizing budgets and timelines. In the midst of this, Barbara received invitations to speak at small design forums about ethical renovation. She was no celebrity, but her name carried weight in the interior design community, enough that people wanted to hear how she balanced creative vision with preserving a neighborhood's essence. Rather than shy away, she accepted a handful of these invites, feeling a renewed sense of professional purpose. One crisp Saturday, she invited Richard along to a local college seminar where she'd been asked to give a short talk. Clutching her notes, she appeared both excited and nervous as they arrived on campus. The seminar room buzzed with students, mostly design majors, waiting to learn about real-world projects. Barbara's modest baby bump was more noticeable now, yet her poise remained graceful. Thomas had also been invited to join the panel. After a brief introduction from the college's department head, he and Barbara took seats at the front, while Richard settled into the audience. The first speaker was an architect who spoke on historical preservation. Then it was Barbara's turn. She cleared her throat, gaze sweeping over the rows of curious faces. When I began my interior design career, I envisioned flashy hotels and upscale homes. But over time, I realized design isn't just about aesthetics, it's also about empathy. When you're working on a project that affects people's homes, you're touching their lives in a deep way. Behind her, slides displayed images of the old brownstones from the redevelopment site. One showed peeling wallpaper and a threadbare couch, a testament to years of wear and limited resources. Another showed families standing in doorways, their expressions wary. "We could have demolished these buildings," Barbara continued, "but that would have erased decades of community history, people's memories, their sense of place. Instead, we're restoring what we can and redesigning the interiors to meet modern needs. It's more complicated, more expensive in the short run, but the human cost of a quick teardown is higher than any budget line can quantify." A hush fell over the room. Richard watched as she described the process of engaging residents, listening to their stories, and weaving those insights into the design strategy. She spoke about negotiating with developers, glancing in his direction, though without naming him specifically, and balancing financial realities against ethical obligations. Thomas chimed in about forging partnerships with local businesses and training programs for youth who might learn construction or design skills. When you integrate the community at every level, from brainstorming to execution, the result feels more like a collective victory than a top-down directive, he said. After their talks, students peppered them with questions. How do you handle investor pressure? Is there a risk residents still won't be able to afford the new units? What do you do if the community disagrees with your design? Barbara and Thomas answered openly, sharing the complexities rather than offering simplistic solutions. Richard felt a stirring sense of pride as he watched them handle each query with candor. Eventually, the seminar wrapped with polite applause. A cluster of students surrounded Barbara, eager to know more. Meanwhile, Thomas approached Richard, clapping him on the back. "She's really shining up there," Thomas observed quietly. Richard smiled, a mix of admiration and lingering regret in his eyes. "She always had that spark. I just never realized how important it was to let it grow, rather than overshadow it with my own agenda." Thomas studied him, nodding. "Well, you're both learning. That's what matters." With that, he left Richard to join the final group discussion. By the time Barbara gathered her things, the auditorium had mostly emptied. She looked tired but elated, a flush coloring her cheeks. "You were amazing," Richard told her, stepping forward. "I'm serious. People were hanging on every word." She laughed softly. "I don't know if I'd go that far, but it felt good to share what we've been doing. It reminds me why it's worth fighting for." Then she pressed a hand to her belly. "And for this little one, too." He glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. Then he gently placed his palm atop hers, a rush of protective warmth flooding him. "We're doing this for us, for the baby, for the families who trust us not to betray them," he thought. Soon they walked out into the crisp afternoon sunshine, side by side. Barbara's footsteps slowed. "Richard?" she asked softly. "Yeah. I'm really glad we did this together. There was a time I never imagined we'd be in the same room again, let alone collaborating." He nodded, exhaling. "I'm grateful too. It's like we're finally starting to see each other clearly." He paused, then added, "And maybe we can share these lessons." Not just about design or development, but about how to actually listen to the people who matter most. She offered a smile that hinted at both the weight of their shared history and the hope now taking root. Then, arm in arm, they ventured into the campus courtyard, leaving behind the seminar room, but carrying forward the lessons they'd gleaned from adversity, perseverance, and a willingness to change. The final stretch of Barbara's pregnancy seemed to pass in a blur of last-minute project details and a swirl of emotional milestones. As the renovations kicked off, large portions of the old brownstones began receiving fresh coats of paint, safer wiring, and upgraded plumbing. Families watched warily, but with growing confidence that this time they wouldn't be forcibly removed. Richard found himself spending late evenings at the project site, checking in on contractors, meeting with Thomas and Janice to ensure smooth coordination. Often, Barbara accompanied him, though her pace had slowed as her belly grew heavier. Despite her fatigue, she insisted on offering input, from color palettes that preserved the neighborhood's charm to functional layouts for accessibility. One particularly cold afternoon, they were finishing a walkthrough of a nearly completed unit when Barbara's face contorted slightly in pain. Alarmed, Richard set down a stack of blueprints. "Are you okay? What's wrong?" She inhaled deeply, then exhaled. "I think it's just a contraction, false labor, maybe." His pulse hammered. "Should we go to the hospital?" She shook her head after a moment, straightening up. It passed. "Let's not panic yet," but the worry in her eyes told him they were quickly nearing the baby's arrival. A few days later, the actual moment arrived. Suddenly, in the middle of a drizzly evening, Barbara woke from a nap with sharper pains and signaled Richard in a breathless tone, "I think it's time." He practically jumped into his shoes, helping her to the car and speeding off toward the hospital. The entire drive, his heart pounded with urgency he'd never felt before. Somehow, the corporate showdowns and investor battles felt trivial compared to the primal, life-altering event about to unfold. As they reached the hospital room, nurses guided Barbara through the standard checks. Her face twisted with each contraction, and Richard stayed by her side, gripping her hand, whispering calming words he barely believed he was capable of uttering. When the pains intensified, she clenched his hand tighter, tears of both agony and anticipation clinging to her lashes. Between gasps, she looked at him. "Don't let go," she whispered. "Never," he promised, voice shaking. Hours stretched, punctuated by beeping monitors and the rushed footsteps of medical staff. At last, Barbara was urged to push. Her screams echoed in the sterile room, but she remained fierce, determined. With one final, powerful effort, a newborn's cry filled the air, raw and miraculous. Richard's breath caught as he glimpsed the tiny form, a baby girl, screaming indignantly at the sudden brightness. Tears stung his eyes before he even registered them. A nurse placed the infant on Barbara's chest, and relief flooded Barbara's exhausted features. For a moment, the world vanished around them. No board meetings, no investor standoffs, no overshadowing regrets. There was only the sound of a newborn's cries and the overwhelming sense that a new chapter had begun. Later, when things calmed, Barbara cradled their daughter, gazing at her with awe. Richard stood close, gently touching the baby's fingers, his throat tight with emotion. "Look at her," he whispered. "She's perfect." Barbara nodded, tears leaking freely down her cheeks. "I never thought we'd have this," she murmured. "Not after everything." A light knock at the door announced Margaret, Richard's mother, who had flown in from Florida the moment she got the call. She peeked in timidly, then rushed forward, eyes brimming with joy. "Oh, my goodness," she exclaimed, carefully stroking the baby's cheek. "She's beautiful." Richard's eyes were misty as he introduced, "Mom, meet Lily Reeves." Margaret let out a soft gasp at the name, brushing a tear aside. She glanced between Richard and Barbara, her smile trembling with emotion. "I'm so happy for you both." Later that evening, after Margaret stepped out to call relatives and the hospital quieted, Barbara turned to Richard with a mixture of tiredness and gratitude. "Thank you for staying," she said softly. "I know we still have a lot to figure out, but this feels like the start of something real." He kissed the top of her head, then gently rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you," he said, voice husky, "I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." In that moment, Lily stirred in her arms, and Barbara smiled, exhaustion etched in every line of her face but a deep contentment shining through. Richard swallowed a lump in his throat, aware of how far they'd come, from the icy brink of divorce to this hospital room, where a new family breathed its first breaths. He pictured the homes under renovation, the tenants who had put their trust in him, the board members who still needed convincing. The future might hold more challenges, but for now, in this quiet, softly lit space, he felt a wholeness he'd never known. Cradling Lily's tiny head, he marveled at the fragile life they had helped bring into the world. This is the real legacy, he thought, tears finally slipping free. Not the skyscrapers or the million-dollar deals, but the promise we make to love and nurture something far more precious. A hush fell over them, punctuated only by the baby's soft whimper. Barbara closed her eyes, resting against the pillows, and Richard held them both in a protective embrace. Beyond the hospital windows, the city lights twinkled as if bearing witness. It was not a grand finale, but a tender new beginning. An unexpected gift that had emerged from the strains and triumphs of their shared journey, destined to lead them into a tomorrow full of promise and, at last, hope. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.